Imagine receiving a distress call from a vessel that sank before you were born, the voice crackling through the static, urgent and afraid, calling for rescue from waters that have long since claimed the ship. On March 15th, 1989, maritime radio operators along the North Atlantic coast received exactly such a transmission, a desperate SOS from the SS Orang Medan, a cargo freighter that had disappeared beneath the waves in 1959, taking all hands with it. How could a crew long dead transmit a plea for help? How could instruments detect a signal from a ship whose wreckage lay 3 miles down on the ocean floor? In this documentary, we explore not just this impossible radio call, but a series of connected events that span 3 decades. Strange sightings of a phantom vessel, crew members found alive with no memory of the intervening years, and maritime anomalies that suggest time itself may flow differently in certain stretches of ocean. These are documented events, recorded in official logs, yet utterly inexplicable, that challenge everything we believe about the boundaries between past and present. The morning fog hung thick over the port of Singapore on February 11th, 1959, as the SS Orang Medan prepared to depart for its routine cargo run to the Philippines. The vessel, a Dutch-registered freighter measuring 441 feet from bow to stern, sat low in the water with a full load, its grey hull showing years of service across Pacific trade routes. On board were 37 men, a mix of Dutch, Indonesian, and Chinese crew members who had worked together through multiple voyages. Captain Henrik van der Linde, a veteran of 23 years at sea, oversaw the final checks as longshoremen secured the last of the cargo and dock workers released the mooring lines. The manifest listed machine parts, textiles, and general freight bound for Manila, nothing unusual for a vessel that had made the same journey dozens of times. The weather report promised clear conditions after the morning haze burned off, and there was no reason to expect anything other than an uneventful 3-day passage across the South China Sea. The engines rumbled to life as the Orang Medan pulled away from the dock, its wake spreading across the harbour's oily surface. Radio operator Robert Chen transmitted the standard departure notification to port authorities, confirming the ship's course and estimated arrival time. First Officer Thomas Kellerman checked the navigation charts one final time, marking their intended route along the established shipping lanes that curved northeast toward the Philippine archipelago. Below deck, Chief Engineer David Park monitored the engine room's gauges, listening to the steady rhythm that would carry them across open water. For the first 48 hours, the voyage proceeded exactly as planned. Chen maintained regular radio contact with coastal stations, reporting their position at scheduled intervals, his transmissions calm and routine. The crew went about their duties without incident, some playing cards during off hours, others writing letters they would mail upon reaching Manila, and a few standing watch on deck as the ship cut through moderate swells under clear skies. On the evening of February 13th, as the Orang Medan passed the halfway point of its journey, something aboard the vessel began to change. Chen's scheduled transmission at 8 p.m. came through as expected, but operators at the receiving station later noted that his voice had carried a subtle edge of tension, though the words themselves reported nothing amiss. By midnight, when the next check-in was due, no transmission arrived. Coastal stations attempted to raise the ship on multiple frequencies, but their calls went unanswered. At 2:17 a.m. on February 14th, Chen's voice suddenly broke through the static, rapid and strained, reporting that crew members were falling ill throughout the ship. He described men collapsing without warning, some clutching their throats, others simply dropping where they stood. The transmission lasted less than 30 seconds before cutting off mid-sentence, leaving operators scrambling to re-establish contact. 15 minutes later, another burst of communication came through, this time fragmented and difficult to parse. Chen's words tumbled over each other as he attempted to describe What was happening aboard the dying ship? Officers were dead in the chart room, he reported, their bodies arranged in strange positions as though they had frozen in the act of reaching for something. The captain lay across his desk, eyes open but unseeing. Throughout the vessel, crew members had collapsed, and Chen himself felt the onset of whatever affliction had claimed the others. His voice carried not just fear, but confusion, as though what he witnessed defied his ability to comprehend. The final transmission, received at 2:43 a.m. and recorded by 3 separate coastal stations, contained only a brief, chilling message in Morse code. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. The signal continued for several seconds more, the operator's hand apparently still on the key, and then ceased entirely without the standard sign-off protocols that would indicate an intentional end to transmission. Multiple vessels in the vicinity received emergency routing from maritime authorities and altered course to provide assistance. The Silver Star, an American merchant ship travelling northbound from Indonesia, was closest to the last known coordinates and reached the area by dawn on February 14th. Crew members, scanning the horizon, spotted the Orang Medan drifting with the current, its engines silent and no one visible on deck. The Silver Star's captain ordered a boarding party prepared, and 8 men crossed to the stricken freighter in a launch, climbing aboard to find a scene that would haunt their accounts for years afterward. Every crew member, they discovered, was dead, bodies sprawled across the deck and in the corridors below, faces locked in expressions that suggested they had died in terror. Some appeared to be pointing at nothing, arms extended toward empty air. Others lay curled in defensive positions, as though trying to protect themselves from an invisible threat. The boarding party found Captain van der Linde slumped in his chair on the bridge, papers scattered around him, his eyes wide and his mouth open, as if interrupted mid-shout. The ship itself showed no signs of damage, no indication of fire or collision, or any physical cause for the catastrophe. The cargo hold remained sealed, its contents apparently undisturbed. Instruments on the bridge appeared functional, though several crew members from the Silver Star reported feeling an unusual heaviness in the air, a pressure that made breathing difficult and movement sluggish. The boarding party's leader, First Officer James Harwell, later described a strange smell permeating the vessel, something he could not identify but that reminded him of burnt metal mixed with a sweet, cloying scent. One of the rescue crew became violently ill shortly after entering the chart room and had to be helped back to the launch. As Harwell prepared to organise the towing of the Orang Medan back to the nearest port, smoke began rising from the cargo hold without warning or apparent source. Within minutes, flames erupted from below deck, spreading with unnatural speed through sections of the ship that should have contained nothing flammable. The boarding party evacuated immediately, barely clearing the vessel before the fire intensified. Explosions rocked the Orang Medan, tearing holes in its hull and sending debris arcing into the morning sky. The Silver Star pulled back to a safe distance as the freighter burned, its structure collapsing inward as flames consumed what remained. By midday, the vessel had slipped beneath the surface, taking with it all evidence of what had occurred aboard. The bodies of the 37 crew members, the mysterious cargo, and whatever had killed them so quickly vanished into water that charts showed reached depths of over 15,000 feet in that location. Rescue ships circled the site for hours, searching for any survivors who might have escaped in life rafts, but the ocean's surface remained empty save for scattered debris and an oil slick that marked where the Orang Medan had disappeared. Maritime authorities launched an immediate investigation, interviewing the Silver Star's crew and reviewing the radio transmissions recorded during the ship's final hours. The inquiry focused on potential causes, toxic cargo, poisonous gas leaks, structural failures that might have released deadly fumes, but none of the theories aligned with the evidence. The cargo manifest listed only standard commercial freight, nothing that could account for the rapid death of an entire crew. The ship had passed its most recent safety inspection without issue, and maintenance records showed no deferred repairs or known mechanical problems. Weather conditions had been favourable, ruling out sudden storms or rogue waves. The boarding party's descriptions of the crew's frozen expressions and defensive postures suggested exposure to something terrifying as well as lethal, yet no known toxin produced such effects. Investigators noted the strange smell reported by Harwell and others, but with the ship at the bottom of the sea, no samples could be taken for analysis. The official conclusion, reached after 6 weeks of inquiry, stated only that the SS Urang Medan had been lost with all hands due to causes unknown. The report acknowledged the unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths, but offered no definitive explanation, noting that the rapid sinking and complete destruction of evidence made further investigation impossible. Families of the crew received notification of the loss and were told that their loved ones had died in a maritime disaster, with no mention of the disturbing details witnessed by the boarding party. Memorial services were held in 3 countries, with many of the deceased having no bodies to bury. The ship's owners filed insurance claims and quietly retired the Urang Medan's name from their fleet registry. Within months, the case had been filed away in maritime archives, another entry in the long catalogue of ships lost at sea, its circumstances relegated to the footnotes of naval history. For those who had been aboard the Silver Star, however, the memory of that morning refused to fade. Harwell wrote privately to colleagues about the scene he had witnessed, describing not just the dead crew, but the oppressive atmosphere that had made the ship feel wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. Other members of the boarding party reported recurring nightmares of frozen faces and pointing fingers, of walking through corridors where the air itself seemed hostile. Some refused to discuss what they had seen, while others became convinced that whatever had killed the Urang Medan's crew had been unnatural, beyond any conventional maritime hazard. These accounts circulated quietly through seafaring communities, shared in dockside conversations and late-night watches, creating a legend that persisted even as official records remained sealed and unremarkable. The SS Urang Medan was officially declared lost with all hands on February 14, 1959, its wreckage resting in waters too deep for recovery. For the families of the 37 men aboard, the absence of bodies and the mystery surrounding their deaths left grief suspended in a space where questions would never find answers. The ship's final resting place became a grave marker in the ocean, and the case file was quietly closed, joining the long list of maritime tragedies where the sea keeps its secrets. The coordinates where the vessel had gone down were noted in shipping charts as the location of a sunken wreck, but few captains paid much attention to one more lost ship in waters that had claimed hundreds over the decades. No memorial marked the spot, no buoys warned of the debris field below. The ocean moved on, its surface revealing nothing of what lay in the darkness beneath, and the story of the Urang Medan seemed destined to remain one more unsolved mystery among many. 30 years would pass before the SS Urang Medan would make its presence known again. The night shift at the Coast Guard station in Halifax was winding down when radio operator Samuel Brennan heard the first crackle of an incoming distress signal just after 2 a.m. on March 15, 1989. Brennan, a veteran radio operator with 15 years of experience monitoring North Atlantic maritime traffic, had heard thousands of routine transmissions and dozens of genuine emergencies, and his instincts told him immediately that something about this signal felt wrong. The frequency was correct for international distress calls, but the transmission carried an odd quality, a hollowness in the static that reminded him of recordings played through old equipment. He adjusted his headset and leaned closer to the console as the voice emerged more clearly from the interference, speaking in accented English with the formal phrasing of an earlier era. The caller identified his vessel as the SS Urang Medan and provided coordinates placing the ship approximately 200 miles east of Newfoundland, within a heavily travelled section of the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Brennan's hand moved automatically to log the information, but the ship's name triggered recognition that made him pause. He had studied maritime history as a hobby, and the Orang Medan was a name he knew from accounts of unexplained disappearances. His first thought was that someone was using the name of a historical vessel, perhaps a newly commissioned ship bearing the same designation, but something about the transmission's tone and the caller's urgency suggested this was no routine distress call. The voice reported that crew members were falling ill, that officers had collapsed, and that the ship required immediate assistance. The phrasing matched descriptions Brennan had read of the original 1959 distress calls, and a cold unease began to settle over him as he realised the message was being delivered word for word as it had been 3 decades earlier. Brennan immediately contacted the watch supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh, who joined him at the console to listen to the ongoing transmission. The voice continued to report deteriorating conditions aboard the vessel, describing symptoms and circumstances that seemed pulled directly from historical records. Walsh ordered an immediate cross-check with other coastal stations to verify they were receiving the same signal, and within minutes, confirmations came back from stations in Newfoundland, Maine, and Nova Scotia. All reported hearing identical transmissions on the same frequency, all placing the vessel at the same coordinates, and all noting the strange, dated quality of the communication. Walsh pulled up the maritime registry, while Brennan maintained contact, attempting to respond to the distress call, but his transmissions seemed to go unheard. The caller continued his report without acknowledgement, as though broadcasting into a void that could not answer back. The computer search confirmed what Brennan had already suspected. The SS Orang Medan was listed in historical records as lost with all hands on February 14, 1959, in the South China Sea, thousands of miles from the coordinates now being transmitted. The vessel had been a Dutch-registered freighter that had sunk following a mysterious disaster, and no ship bearing that name had been registered since. Walsh stared at the screen for a long moment before reaching for the emergency protocols manual. Knowing that standard procedures offered no guidance for responding to distress calls from ships that had been at the bottom of the ocean for 30 years. She ordered the immediate dispatch of rescue vessels to the coordinates provided, aware that the decision would raise questions but unwilling to ignore any possibility that lives might be at stake, however impossible the circumstances seemed. As rescue cutters were scrambled from the nearest Coast Guard station, the transmission from the Orang Medan entered its second phase. The voice, now clearly distressed and speaking more rapidly, reported that the captain and all officers were dead. The exact phrasing matched the final recorded message from 1959, a detail that Brennan confirmed by pulling archived transcripts from the station's historical files. He and Walsh listened in growing disbelief as the transmission unfolded precisely as it had 3 decades earlier, each word matching the historical record. The caller described bodies in the chart room, crew members collapsed throughout the vessel, and his own failing strength. For several seconds, only the sound of laboured breathing came through the speakers, and then a final burst of Morse code spelled out the same message that had ended the original transmission. Possibly whole crew dead. The signal cut off abruptly at 2:43 a.m., exactly 40 minutes after Brennan had first detected it. The silence that followed felt heavier than the static that had preceded the transmission, as though something fundamental had shifted in the ordinary flow of radio waves. Brennan sat motionless at his console, watching the frequency indicator for any sign of the signal's return, but the channel remained empty. Walsh contacted the rescue vessels that were now racing toward the coordinates, instructing them to maintain full alert and report any visual or radar contacts immediately. Both officers knew what they had heard defied rational explanation, but the recordings existed, time-stamped and verified by multiple stations. Whatever had generated that transmission had occurred, regardless of whether they could understand how. The rescue cutters reached the coordinates by dawn, their crews scanning empty waters under a cloudless sky. Radar showed no contacts, visual searches revealed no vessels or debris, and radio calls on all frequencies went unanswered. The ocean stretched unbroken in every direction, its surface disturbed only by moderate swells that bore no sign of recent activity. The search expanded outward in a standard grid pattern, covering hundreds of square miles over the following 12 hours, but nothing was found. No life rafts, no oil slicks, no floating wreckage that might indicate a ship in distress or recently sunk. The cutters returned to port with their crews unsettled and confused, having found only open ocean where a vessel had reportedly been calling for help hours earlier. By mid-morning, radio operators from the 4 stations that had received the transmission gathered via conference call to compare their recordings. Each station played back its captured audio, and the matches were exact down to the timing of pauses and the specific inflections in the caller's voice. Technical analysis confirmed that the transmissions were genuine radio signals, not recordings played over the airwaves or some form of atmospheric echo. The voice patterns showed characteristics of live speech with natural variations in breath and pitch that would be absent from playback of archived material. Frequency analysis revealed the signal had originated from the coordinates provided, transmitted with power levels consistent with a ship-mounted radio of the type used in the 1950s, not modern maritime communication equipment. The Coast Guard's official investigation began within 24 hours, interviewing all personnel who had been on duty during the incident and reviewing every piece of recorded data. Brennan provided detailed testimony about his recognition of the ship's name and the exact match between the transmission and historical records. Walsh described her decision-making process and the unsuccessful search efforts. Technical specialists examined the radio equipment at all receiving stations to rule out malfunctions or interference that might have created the impression of a genuine distress call. Every system checked out as functioning normally, with no anomalies detected beyond the impossible transmission itself. Attempts to explain the event through conventional means quickly exhausted themselves. Some investigators suggested that atmospheric conditions might have caused a signal from 1959 to somehow bounce through layers of the ionosphere and return to Earth 30 years later. But atmospheric physicists dismissed this as beyond the boundaries of known propagation effects. Radio waves do not store themselves for decades before transmission, and even if such storage were possible, the signal would degrade beyond recognition. Others proposed elaborate hoaxes, perhaps orchestrated by someone with access to historical records and sophisticated radio equipment, but the simultaneous reception at multiple stations across hundreds of miles of coastline made coordinated hoaxing implausible. The voice itself, analysed by linguistic experts, showed speech patterns and accents consistent with multilingual crew members of the 1950s, details that would be extraordinarily difficult to fake convincingly. The most troubling aspect of the incident, noted repeatedly in investigation reports, was the precision with which the transmission matched the historical record. Not approximately, not in general terms, but word for word, pause for pause, exactly as documented in 1959 archives. The probability of someone recreating such an exact duplicate, including technical characteristics of period radio equipment and authentic-sounding distress, seemed vanishingly small. Yet the alternative, that the original transmission had somehow reached forward through 3 decades to broadcast in 1989, defied every principle of physics and temporal logic. The investigating team found itself trapped between impossible explanations, unable to endorse either the supernatural or the hoax theory with full confidence. By the time the official report was filed in late April, the Coast Guard had documented the incident thoroughly, but offered no definitive conclusion about its origin. The report acknowledged that multiple stations had received genuine radio transmissions, identifying as the SS Urang Medan, that rescue efforts had found no vessel at the reported coordinates, and that the content of the transmissions matched historical records with extraordinary precision. The final paragraph, carefully worded after review by multiple supervisors, stated only that the incident remained under investigation and that maritime traffic should maintain standard vigilance in the affected area. No mention was made of time anomalies or impossible communications, but the report's very existence in Coast Guard files represented official acknowledgement that something unexplainable had occurred. For Brennan and the other operators who had heard that voice calling out across the decades, the experience left a lasting impression that no official explanation, or lack thereof, could erase. Brennan would later describe the sensation of listening to the transmission as feeling like he had become a bridge between two moments in time, receiving a message that had been sent long ago but was arriving only now. The caller's desperation had been palpable, his fear genuine, and the knowledge that the man had died 30 years earlier, while Brennan listened to his final words, created a dissonance that refused to resolve. The recordings existed on magnetic tape, time-stamped and verified by multiple sources, yet the ship they came from lay in pieces on the ocean floor, thousands of miles away and 3 miles down. Some suggested equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference replaying old signals, but the technical precision of the coordinates and the clarity of the voices resisted such explanations. For those who had heard the desperation in that final message, cutting off mid-word just as it had 3 decades earlier, no rational explanation could erase the certainty that something beyond their understanding had reached out from the past. The tape reels sat in an evidence locker, preserving a voice that should not exist in 1989, speaking words that had been spoken and recorded in 1959, creating a temporal paradox that instruments could verify but minds struggled to accept. The radio transmissions would prove to be only the first in a series of mist rolled across the grey waters of the North Atlantic as the fishing trawler Margaret's Hope hauled nets through the pre-dawn darkness, 30 miles east of the coordinates where the impossible radio transmissions had originated 3 weeks earlier. Captain Dermot Walsh, a 30-year veteran of Atlantic fishing who had weathered storms and equipment failures with equal calm, stood at the wheel, watching the horizon lighten to a pale grey that promised another overcast day. His crew of 6 moved about their work with the practiced efficiency of men who had fished these waters for decades, their voices carrying across the deck in fragments of conversation about catch weights and market prices. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be anything other than routine until the lookout called attention to something emerging from a thick fog bank several hundred yards to starboard. Walsh turned his attention toward the shape materializing through the mist, initially assuming it was another fishing vessel or perhaps a cargo ship passing through the area. As the form became clearer, however, details began to register that made no sense. The vessel was large, a cargo freighter by the look of its profile, but its design seemed decades out of date. The hull configuration, the placement of the superstructure, and the style of the smokestack all suggested a ship from the middle of the previous century rather than anything currently in service. Walsh reached for his binoculars and focused on the approaching vessel, noting with growing confusion that it showed no running lights despite the dim conditions and moved through the water with an unnatural stillness, leaving no visible wake behind it. The paint scheme became visible as the distance closed, and Walsh felt the first flutter of genuine unease. The colours and markings matched descriptions he had heard in dockside conversations about the SS Urang Medan, the ghost ship that had supposedly transmitted distress calls weeks earlier. He had dismissed those stories as exaggerated retellings of a radio malfunction, but the vessel before him bore every characteristic mentioned in those accounts. dark grey hull, white superstructure, and lettering along the bow that he could not yet read, but that seemed positioned exactly where a ship's name would be displayed. The Margaret's Hope drew closer, Walsh reducing speed to maintain a safe distance, and his crew gathered along the rail to stare at the silent freighter that drifted parallel to their course. Walsh attempted radio contact on multiple frequencies, identifying his vessel and requesting the other ship to acknowledge, but his calls went unanswered. The VHF radio produced only static, and even the emergency channel yielded no response. One of his crew members, a young man named Patrick Hennessy, pointed out that he could see figures on the deck of the freighter, dark shapes that appeared to be standing near the rail, but they showed no sign of movement or awareness of the Margaret's Hope, despite being close enough for easy visual contact. The stillness of those figures troubled Walsh more than their presence, as even crew members at rest would shift position, gesture, or show some indication of life. These shapes remained frozen in place like mannequins arranged on a stage set. The temperature dropped noticeably as the two vessels maintained their parallel course, and Walsh's breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Several crew members complained of the cold, pulling jackets tighter despite having been comfortable moments earlier. The compass mounted above the helm started spinning slowly, its needle refusing to settle on any heading, and the depth sounder flickered between readings that made no sense for their known location. Walsh had seen instruments malfunction during electrical storms and near underwater magnetic anomalies, but the clear conditions and the specific nature of the disturbances suggested something different at work. His instincts, honed through 3 decades of reading the ocean's moods, screamed that the situation was wrong in ways he could not articulate. He ordered the helmsman to bring the Margaret's Hope closer, close enough to read the name on the freighter's bow. As they drew within 50 yards, the lettering became visible through the thinning mist, painted in a style and font that confirmed the ship's age. SS Orang Medan was spelled out in white letters against the dark hull, each character clear and undeniable. Walsh felt his chest tighten as the impossible name stared back at him, and he heard his crew murmuring behind him, some cursing softly, others simply falling silent. Patrick moved to the spotlight mounted near the wheelhouse and trained it on the freighter, illuminating a section of deck where the frozen figures stood. In the harsh white beam, details became visible that deepened the mystery rather than explaining it. The figures wore clothing that appeared authentic to the 1950s, dark work uniforms and caps of a style no longer common on modern vessels. Their faces, illuminated briefly before Patrick swept the light away in instinctive revulsion, showed no expression, no reaction to the sudden illumination. They simply stood in position, staring toward nothing, their features pale and somehow incomplete as though viewed through a layer of fog that clung to them alone. Walsh ordered the light turned off, not wanting to see more, and watched as the Orang Medan continued its silent drift through the water. No sound of engines carried across the gap between vessels, no vibration of machinery running, no indication that anything powered the freighter's movement beyond the current itself. The fog that had retreated moments earlier began thickening again, with unnatural speed, rolling back across the water in dense billows that obscured the horizon in all directions. Walsh turned the Margaret's Hope away from the phantom freighter, suddenly wanting distance and clear air more than answers to the mystery before him. As his vessel came about, the last glimpse he caught of the Orang Medan showed it beginning to fade into the encroaching mist, its outline softening and losing definition as though the fog were erasing it stroke by stroke. Within seconds, the freighter had vanished completely, swallowed by whiteness that seemed to have appeared solely for that purpose. The temperature returned to normal almost immediately. The instruments ceased their erratic behaviour, and the compass needle swung back to its proper heading. Walsh maintained his new course for several minutes, putting distance between his position and where the encounter had occurred, before finally reducing speed and allowing his crew to process what they had witnessed. Patrick spoke first, his voice shaking slightly as he described the faces he had seen in the spotlight's beam. Others confirmed the details Walsh had noted: the lack of wake, the absence of engine sounds, the frozen crew, and the impossible name painted on the bow. Every man aboard had seen the same things, and their accounts matched in every particular, ruling out individual hallucination or misperception. They had witnessed a vessel that should not exist, crewed by men who should be long dead, drifting through waters where no radar had detected its presence. When they returned to port later that morning, Walsh filed a formal report with maritime authorities, including sketches drawn by his first mate, showing the vessel's configuration and the position of the figures they had observed. The report was acknowledged, logged into the official record, and filed away with no indication that follow-up investigation would occur. Officials Walsh spoke with seemed reluctant to discuss the matter, offering only vague comments about atmospheric conditions creating optical illusions, or the possibility that he had seen a derelict vessel, mistaken for something more mysterious. These explanations satisfied no one aboard the Margaret's Hope, least of all Walsh himself, who had spent 30 years distinguishing real vessels from tricks of light and distance. In the days that followed, Walsh learned that he was not the first captain to report seeing the Orang Medan in waters where it should not be. Conversations in port revealed a pattern of sightings stretching back years, though most captains had kept their experiences private rather than risk professional ridicule. The stories shared common elements: fog, silence, frozen crew, and the sudden disappearance of the vessel as though it had never existed. Some accounts dated back to the 1960s, suggesting that the phantom freighter had been making appearances for decades, always in the North Atlantic, always bearing the same name, and always vanishing before any meaningful investigation could be mounted. The crew of the Margaret's Hope docked at dawn with a story shaken by what they had witnessed. Walsh, known for his pragmatic nature and 3 decades of experience on unpredictable seas, filed an official report with maritime authorities, including sketches of the vessel drawn by his first mate. The report was logged, acknowledged, and quietly filed away, with no follow-up investigation. For the crew, however, the memory remained vivid: the impossible ship emerging from fog, its name clear on the hull, the unnatural stillness that had surrounded it, and the certainty that they had seen something that should not exist. As reports of the sighting spread through maritime communities, other accounts began to surface, whispered stories from captains who had been reluctant to speak. In the weeks following the Margaret's Hope sighting, maritime offices along the Atlantic coast received a series of letters and phone calls from retired captains, each describing encounters they had kept secret for years. The publicised reports of the phantom vessel had given voice to experiences that many had believed too strange to share, and the sudden willingness of experienced mariners to come forward revealed a pattern that stretched back nearly 3 decades. These were not young sailors prone to superstition or misidentification, but men who had spent careers navigating difficult waters and who understood the difference between natural phenomena and something genuinely unexplainable. Their testimonies, delivered with the measured caution of those who had learned to weigh their words carefully, described encounters that matched the recent events in disturbing detail. Captain Erik Johansen, a Norwegian tanker commander who had retired to Oslo in 1985, wrote to authorities describing an incident from October 1962. His vessel, the Nordic Star, had been crossing the North Atlantic on a routine petroleum transport when fog descended with unusual speed, reducing visibility to near zero despite clear conditions moments earlier. Within the fog, Johansen reported seeing another ship keeping pace with his tanker, visible only as a dark silhouette that appeared and disappeared as the mist shifted. He attempted radio contact repeatedly, but received no response, and when the fog finally lifted, after 20 minutes, the other vessel had vanished entirely. What troubled Johansen enough to finally report the encounter was the brief moment when visibility had cleared, enough for him to see the ship's name painted on its hull. He had recognized it as the SS Orang Medan, a vessel he knew from maritime records had been lost 3 years earlier. A similar account came from Captain William Fraser, who had commanded the commercial freighter Atlantic Promise through the 1970s before retiring to Halifax. His letter described an encounter from March 1971, when his ship passed within a quarter mile of what appeared to be a cargo vessel drifting without power. Fraser altered course to offer assistance, standard practice for any vessel finding another in potential distress, but as the Atlantic Promise approached, the other ship seemed to recede despite showing no sign of active propulsion. The pursuit continued for nearly an hour, with Fraser maintaining steady speed while the distance between vessels remained constant, as though he were chasing a mirage that moved at exactly his pace. When he finally abandoned the attempt and resumed his original heading, he looked back to see the vessel had disappeared completely, leaving no wake or any other trace of its presence. Lieutenant Commander Richard Moss, retired from the Coast Guard in 1980, came forward with an account that carried particular weight given his official capacity during the incident. In August 1978, his patrol vessel had responded to reports of a derelict ship spotted by a commercial airliner approximately 60 miles off the coast of Maine. Moss and his crew reached the coordinates within 2 hours and found a large freighter drifting with the current, showing no lights and displaying no flag. Standard protocols required identifying the vessel and determining whether it required assistance, so Moss brought his patrol boat alongside and attempted to hail the ship on multiple frequencies. The complete silence that greeted his calls, combined with the absence of any visible crew, prompted him to prepare a boarding party. Before the launch could be deployed, however, fog rolled in with such speed that visibility dropped to 0 in less than a minute. By the time conditions cleared 10 minutes later, the freighter had vanished, and radar showed only empty ocean. What made these accounts particularly compelling was their consistency across witnesses who had no connection to one another and who had experienced their encounters years apart. Each described fog appearing suddenly and without meteorological explanation. Each reported attempts at radio communication that went unanswered. Each noted the unnatural silence and absence of normal ship sounds. Several mentioned seeing crew-like figures on deck who showed no awareness of being observed. Most significantly, those who had gotten close enough to read the vessel's name all reported seeing SS Orang Medan painted on the hull, despite the ship having sunk decades earlier in waters thousands of miles away. Maritime historians examining these newly surfaced reports began to trace a pattern that suggested the sightings occurred on a roughly cyclical basis. While the exact frequency varied, encounters seemed to cluster around intervals of 3 to 4 years, with occasional gaps of longer duration. Geographic analysis showed that all verified sightings had occurred within a 100-mile radius of a central point in the North Atlantic, creating an informal zone where captains learned to maintain heightened awareness. The area did not correspond to any known maritime hazard or unusual oceanographic feature, but its reputation grew among those who worked the Atlantic shipping lanes. Older sailors began referring to the region informally as the Orang Medan Zone, and some shipping companies quietly adjusted routes to avoid passing through it when alternatives existed. Not all encounters had been kept completely secret. A handful of captains had filed reports with maritime authorities over the years, but these documents had been processed as routine observations of derelict vessels or possible smuggling operations and had never been connected into a larger pattern. When researchers pulled these scattered reports from various archives and compared them, the similarities became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Descriptions of the vessel's physical characteristics matched historical records of the actual SS Orang Medan with precision that suggested either genuine sightings of the impossible or an extraordinarily detailed and long-running hoax that would have required coordination across multiple countries and decades. The question of motivation arose repeatedly in discussions of the phenomenon. If the sightings were fabrications or misidentifications, what purpose did they serve? The captains who came forward gained nothing from their testimonies except potential damage to their professional reputations. Many had waited until retirement to speak precisely because they feared their accounts would not be believed or would be used to question their competence. The absence of any pattern of attention-seeking or financial gain among the witnesses lent credibility to their claims, as did their consistent reluctance to sensationalize their experiences. These were men describing events they found troubling and inexplicable, not storytellers embellishing for effect. Some researchers attempted to find natural explanations for the pattern of encounters. Theories ranged from unusual weather phenomena creating optical illusions to the possibility of a surviving vessel that had adopted the Orang Medan's name for unknown reasons. The weather explanation struggled to account for the specific and consistent details reported across different years and conditions. The surviving vessel theory faced the problem of explaining how such a ship could appear and disappear without leaving any radar trace, documentation, or port records. More exotic suggestions involved experimental military craft or classified operations, but these theories could not explain why such activities would span 3 decades or why they would consistently use the name of a ship lost in 1959. By May 1989, researchers had compiled over a dozen documented sightings spanning 3 decades, each following the same pattern. Fog, a silent vessel bearing the name SS Orang Medan, and a disappearance that left no physical trace. The accounts came from sources with no connection to one another, men who had kept their experiences private out of professional caution, now finding solidarity in shared testimony. Maritime authorities acknowledged the reports but offered no explanation, leaving the pattern to exist in official records as a series of unresolved anomalies that defied conventional maritime science. The phantom vessel had been making itself known for 30 years, appearing just often enough to establish reality while remaining too elusive for systematic study. The phantom sightings were strange enough, but what happened next would prove even more impossible to explain. The sun was climbing toward noon on June 21, 1989, when Portuguese fishermen spotted a small orange life raft drifting in calm waters approximately 40 miles from where the Margaret's Hope had seen the phantom vessel 3 months earlier. The crew of the Nossa Senhora, a traditional fishing boat working the outer edges of the Grand Banks, altered course to investigate what they assumed would be abandoned safety equipment blown loose from a passing ship. As they drew closer, however, Captain Antonio Silva noticed movement within the raft and immediately signalled his crew to prepare for a rescue. A man lay curled in the bottom of the small inflatable vessel, his skin burned dark by sun exposure and his lips cracked from dehydration, but unmistakably alive despite appearing to have been adrift for days. Silva and 2 crew members hauled the raft alongside and carefully transferred the survivor to their deck, where they wrapped him in blankets and offered water in small measured sips to avoid shock to his system. The man was conscious but disoriented, his eyes moving between his rescuers with an expression of profound confusion rather than relief. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with dark hair greying at the temples and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time at sea. His clothing, once the crew looked past the salt stains and damage from exposure, struck them as unusual. The fabric and cut of his merchant marine uniform belonged to a style that had not been standard issue for decades, and the life vest he wore bore manufacturer markings that Silva recognised as dating from the 1950s. As the fisherman attempted to establish the survivor's identity and circumstances, his responses only deepened their confusion. He gave his name as Thomas Kellerman and insisted repeatedly that the date was February 14th, 1959. When Silver gently corrected him, explaining that it was June 1989, Kellerman became agitated, demanding to know what kind of joke was being played on him. He described abandoning his ship that morning after crew members had begun dying from some unknown affliction, entering a life raft with several other men, and drifting for what he believed had been only a few hours before spotting the Nossa Senhora. Silver attempted to explain that 30 years had passed, but Kellerman's reaction suggested genuine incomprehension rather than denial or mental instability induced by trauma. The Nossa Senhora made for the nearest port with medical facilities, and within hours Kellerman had been transferred to a hospital in St. John's, Newfoundland, where physicians began the complex process of assessing both his physical condition and the impossible claims he was making. Dr. Margaret Chen, the emergency room physician who conducted the initial examination, found a patient who was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, but otherwise in remarkably good health for someone who had supposedly been adrift for days. What troubled Chen more than his physical state was his insistence on the date, and his growing distress as he began to grasp that everyone around him believed it was 1989. She ordered a full medical workup, including psychological evaluation, while also requesting that hospital administration contact maritime authorities about the unusual circumstances of the rescue. Blood tests, tissue samples, and detailed physical examination revealed findings that seemed to contradict basic biology. Kellerman's physical age appeared consistent with a man in his late 30s, perhaps 38 to 40 years old, based on cellular markers, skin elasticity, and other standard indicators. When hospital staff retrieved crew records for the SS Orang Medan from maritime archives, however, they discovered that Thomas Kellerman had been born in 1920, which would make him 69 years old if he had survived the ship's 1959 sinking. The mathematical impossibility created by these facts forced physicians to verify their findings repeatedly, checking for conditions that might make a person appear decades younger than their chronological age, but no medical explanation fit the evidence. Fingerprint analysis provided the next layer of verification. Kellerman's prints were taken as part of standard identification procedures and sent to naval archives where records from the 1940s were still maintained. Within 2 days, a match came back confirming that the prints belonged to Thomas Kellerman, who had served in the Merchant Marine during and after World War II and whose service record listed him among the crew of the SS Orang Medan. The fingerprints were identical, not similar, but exactly matching down to the minutest ridge patterns that are unique to each individual and unchanging throughout life. Hospital administrators found themselves confronting documentation that seemed to confirm an impossible claim. The man in their care was physically the same person who had boarded a ship in 1959, unchanged by the 30 years that had elapsed. Psychiatric evaluation began on Kellerman's second day in the hospital, conducted by Dr. Harold Winters, who had 25 years of experience assessing patients with various forms of dissociation and memory disorders. Winters approached the case expecting to find evidence of elaborate delusion or possibly a sophisticated attempt at fraud, but his sessions with Kellerman revealed neither pattern. The patient demonstrated no signs of psychosis, his memories were detailed and internally consistent, and he showed appropriate emotional responses to the situation he found himself in. When Winters asked Kellerman to describe events from 1959, the details matched historical records with precision that would be extraordinarily difficult to fake. Names of crew members, specific cargo manifest details, descriptions of the ship's layout, and minute particulars about life aboard a merchant vessel of that era. Most tellingly, Kellerman could provide no information about anything that had occurred after February 14, 1959. He knew nothing of the decades that had passed, could not recognize current political leaders or major historical events, and expressed genuine shock when shown newspapers describing a world transformed by technologies and social changes he could not have anticipated. His knowledge ended abruptly on the day the Orang Medan went down, as though his personal timeline had simply stopped at that moment and resumed only when the Portuguese fisherman pulled him from the water. Winters documented these findings carefully, noting in his report that while he could not explain the physical evidence supporting Kellerman's age discrepancy, the psychiatric evidence suggested the man genuinely believed his account and showed no indications of intentional deception. Additional verification came through analysis of items found with Kellerman in the life raft. His uniform, despite damage from sun and salt water, was authentic to the period he claimed to be from. Manufactured by a company that had ceased operations in 1962. The life raft itself, examined by maritime equipment specialists, was confirmed as a model produced in the mid-1950s, with materials and construction techniques consistent with that era. Even the rations found in the raft's emergency kit, though spoiled by exposure, were packaged in containers bearing date codes from 1958. Every physical object associated with Kellerman's rescue pointed to 1959 as the origin point, despite his rescue occurring 30 years later. The case attracted attention from maritime authorities, who dispatched investigators to interview Kellerman and review the evidence. Commander Patricia Walsh, who had been involved in the March radio transmission incident, travelled to St. John's personally to conduct the interview. Kellerman's account of the ship's final hours matched the content of those impossible transmissions with extraordinary precision. He described the strange smell that had permeated the cargo hold, the rapid onset of illness among crew members, the captain's growing alarm as officers collapsed around him, and the final desperate decision to abandon ship. His description of entering the life raft included details about which crew members had been with him. He specifically mentioned Robert Chen, the radio operator, and David Park, the navigator, along with one other man whose name he could not recall through the fog of exhaustion. What made Kellerman's testimony particularly compelling was his emotional state when describing these events. For him, they had occurred that morning. The deaths of his shipmates were fresh wounds, not historical tragedies. When he spoke of seeing men he had worked with for months suddenly collapse and die, his distress was immediate and raw. He asked repeatedly about the fate of the other life rafts, wanting to know if Chen and Park had been rescued, if any of the crew had survived. The knowledge that he was asking about events from 30 years earlier, that all official records listed the entire crew as lost with no survivors, had not yet fully penetrated his understanding. To him, his friends might still be adrift and in need of rescue, even though decades had passed since they had last drawn breath. By the end of June, Thomas Kellerman had been transferred to a secure medical facility in Boston, where specialists from multiple disciplines could study what authorities were beginning to quietly acknowledge as an unprecedented case. Neurologists found his brain function entirely normal. Geneticists examined his DNA and found markers consistent with someone born in 1920, but cellular aging consistent with someone in their late 30s. Chronobiologists, specialists in the study of biological time, could offer no framework for understanding how a person could age normally for nearly 40 years and then apparently stop aging entirely for 3 decades. The physical evidence was undeniable. Kellerman's body existed in a state that should not be possible, young by all measurable standards, yet carrying fingerprints and genetic markers that confirmed his identity as a man who should be elderly, if not already deceased. Media outlets began reporting on the case in early July, though authorities released limited information, and Kellerman himself was kept from direct contact with journalists. The story that emerged in newspapers and television broadcasts focused on the mystery of a survivor found in vintage equipment with careful wording that avoided making definitive claims about time displacement or impossible survival. public reaction ranged from fascination to skepticism, with many assuming the case would eventually be revealed as either a hoax or a misunderstanding of mundane circumstances. For those with access to the full medical and forensic evidence, however, the impossibility of conventional explanation became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Kellerman's adjustment to his situation proceeded slowly and with considerable emotional difficulty. As the reality of 30 years having passed began to penetrate his understanding, he experienced grief that went beyond normal bereavement. Everyone he had known in 1959 was either dead or elderly. His sister, whom he remembered as a woman in her early 20s, was now in her 50s, if still alive. The world he had known had been transformed in ways both large and small, from geopolitical shifts to everyday technology, and he found himself a stranger in what should have been his own life. Psychologists working with him noted that his distress went deeper than culture shock or disorientation. It was the fundamental trauma of having been removed from one's proper place in time and deposited in a future one was never meant to see. Hospital staff who interacted with Kellerman regularly described an experience that unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. Speaking with him felt like conversing with someone from the past who had somehow crossed into the present while remaining anchored to their original moment. His speech patterns, his cultural references, his entire worldview belonged to 1959, and no amount of explanation or evidence could fully update his understanding to 1989. He existed as a living artifact, a person out of time in the most literal sense, and his presence created a cognitive dissonance in those around him that was difficult to resolve. By late June, Thomas Kellerman had been transferred to a secure medical facility where specialists from multiple disciplines attempted to understand what they were witnessing. Every test confirmed the impossible. His fingerprints matched records from 40 years earlier. His physical age corresponded to 1959. His memories ended on the day the SS Urang Medan sank, and yet he sat before them, breathing and confused in 1989. Official reports acknowledged the case but offered no conclusion, stating only that the individual claimed to be Thomas Kellerman and that certain physical evidence supported this claim. For Kellerman himself, the knowledge that 30 years had passed in what felt like an instant left him suspended between two times, neither of which felt real. The man who should have died in 1959 now existed in a world he could not recognize, with no bridge between the moment he entered a life raft and the moment fishermen pulled him from water 3 decades later. Thomas Kellerman's reappearance raised questions that authorities were unprepared to answer, but he would not be the last. The beach at Nova Scotia's remote southern shore was deserted on the morning of August 14, 1989, when a jogger discovered a man lying unconscious at the tide line, his body half buried in sand and kelp. Sarah Mackenzie had been running the same coastal path for years, familiar with the debris that storms washed ashore, but the figure sprawled near the water's edge was unmistakably human. She approached, cautiously, calling out before kneeling beside the man to check for signs of life. His pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow, and his skin bore the damage of prolonged sun exposure. Mackenzie ran to the nearest house and called emergency services, returning to wait with the unconscious man until paramedics arrived 20 minutes later. The survivor was transported to a hospital in Halifax, where emergency room staff worked to stabilize what appeared to be a case of severe dehydration and exposure. The patient remained unconscious for the first 3 days, his vital signs gradually strengthening under IV fluids and medical care, but offering no indication of identity or circumstances. His clothing, once cleaned enough to examine properly, raised immediate questions among the nursing staff. The merchant marine uniform he wore matched the style and construction of those issued in the 1950s, and the name tag sewn above the breast pocket read R. Chen in faded letters. When hospital administration ran routine identification checks, the name triggered alerts that had been placed in the system following Thomas Kellerman's discovery 2 months earlier. Dr. Elena Morrison, who had been briefed on the Kellerman case as part of a network of physicians monitoring for similar incidents, was called in to oversee the patient's care. She reviewed the initial medical findings and immediately noted the parallels: apparent age in late 30s, vintage clothing, evidence of having been adrift at sea, and physical condition suggesting recent rather than historical exposure. Morrison ordered the same battery of tests that had been performed on Kellerman, including fingerprint analysis and detailed age assessment, while the patient remained unconscious and unable to provide testimony about his identity or origins. On the morning of August 17th, the man regained consciousness with the same profound disorientation that had characterized Kellerman's awakening. He asked immediately what ship he was on, then where he was, and finally what date it was. When nurses told him he was in a hospital in Halifax and that the date was August 1989, his reaction mirrored Kellerman's almost exactly. Initial disbelief, followed by growing agitation as he insisted they were wrong. He identified himself as Robert Chen, radio operator aboard the SS Orang Medan, and stated that he had abandoned ship on February 14th, 1959, after the crew had begun dying from exposure to something in the cargo hold. His last clear memory before waking in the hospital was entering a life raft with 3 other crew members, including Thomas Kellerman and David Park. The mention of Kellerman's name prompted immediate contact with authorities in Boston, where Kellerman remained under observation. Within hours, investigators were comparing Chen's account with the testimony Kellerman had provided, looking for consistencies or contradictions that might reveal fraud or confirm the impossible. The accounts matched in every significant detail. Both men described the same sequence of events aboard the dying ship, the same decision to abandon vessel, and the same group entering one of the life rafts together. Chen's description of the strange smell emanating from the cargo hold aligned with Kellerman's testimony, and his recollection of which crew members had been where during the final hours aboard ship corroborated details that had not been made public. Fingerprint results returned within 48 hours, confirming that the man in Halifax was indeed Robert Chen, whose prints matched service records from the 1940s when he'd worked on various merchant vessels before joining the crew of the Orang Medan. The physical impossibility of a man born in 1921 appearing to be in his late 30s in 1989 confronted medical staff with the same paradox they had encountered with Kellerman. Every cellular marker, every biological indicator placed Chen's physical age at approximately 38 years old, despite chronological age that should have made him 68. The fingerprints, unchangeable throughout life, proved his identity beyond reasonable doubt, while his body defied the passage of time that his identity confirmed. Chen's medical examination revealed findings identical to those documented in Kellerman's case. Tissue samples showed aging patterns consistent with someone in their late 30s. DNA analysis confirmed genetic markers placing his birth in the early 1920s, while cellular structures indicated recent biological time. His dental work, examined by forensic odontologists, included fillings using materials and techniques common in the 1950s, but no subsequent dental care from the intervening decades. Even the calluses on his hands matched those of someone who had recently worked with rope and metal equipment of the type used on 1950s cargo ships, not the smoother hands that would result from 30 years without such labour. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Rachel Sorensen found Chen in a state similar to Kellerman's, genuinely confused about the discrepancy between his memory and the date he was being told, showing no signs of deception or delusion, and demonstrating detailed knowledge of 1959 while having no information about subsequent decades. Sorensen noted that Chen's emotional responses were appropriate to someone who had just experienced a maritime disaster and the loss of colleagues, not someone recounting events from 30 years earlier. His grief over the deaths he had witnessed aboard the Orang Medan was immediate and raw, unprocessed by time or distance from the trauma. What provided the most compelling verification of Chen's account was his ability to describe aspects of the ship's final hours that only the radio operator would have known. He detailed the exact sequence of distress calls he had sent, including the specific wording and timing that matched archived records from coastal stations that had received those transmissions in 1959. He described his growing panic as he sent messages that went unanswered or received responses he could not understand, as though communication equipment was malfunctioning despite appearing to function normally. His account of the final transmission, sent while watching crew members die around him, included details about technical difficulties with the radio equipment that had not been included in previous reports, but that technical specialists confirmed would explain certain anomalies in the recorded signals. Chen also provided new information about the cargo that had caused the disaster. As radio operator, he had been present when the captain opened the crates in the cargo hold after crew members began falling ill. Chen described seeing containers marked with symbols he did not recognize, not standard shipping markers or any language he could identify. When one crate was opened, a mist had emerged, pale and slightly luminescent, spreading through the hold with unnatural speed. The smell accompanying the mist had been sweet and metallic simultaneously, cloying in a way that made breathing difficult. Within minutes of exposure, crew members began collapsing, and Chen had retreated to send the distress calls that would be his last official duty aboard the ship. Maritime authorities arranged for Chen to be transferred to the same Boston facility where Kellerman was being held, both for security and to allow the two men to be studied together. The reunion between Chen and Kellerman, carefully documented by observers, provided perhaps the most emotionally affecting evidence of the genuine nature of their experiences. The two men recognized each other immediately, embracing with the relief of survivors who had believed themselves alone. Their conversation, recorded for analysis, showed the easy familiarity of colleagues who had worked together recently, referencing shared experiences and inside jokes that would be difficult to fabricate. Both men asked about David Park and the fourth man who had been in their life raft, hoping to learn that others had been rescued as well. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with both survivors together, looking for any inconsistencies between their accounts that might suggest rehearsed fraud. The testimonies aligned in major details while showing natural variations in perspective and memory that would be expected from two people witnessing the same events. Chen remembered certain technical aspects of the radio equipment that Kellerman could not recall, while Kellerman provided details about navigation and course plotting that were outside Chen's areas of expertise. These differences in emphasis and detail actually strengthened the credibility of their accounts, as perfectly matched testimonies would have suggested coordination rather than genuine, independent memory. Both men underwent polygraph examinations administered by specialists experienced in detecting sophisticated deception. The tests showed no indication that either man was being untruthful when describing their experiences. Their physiological responses remained consistent with individuals genuinely recounting remembered events, not constructing false narratives. While polygraph results were not considered definitive proof, they added another layer of evidence suggesting that Kellerman and Chen truly believed they had experienced an instantaneous transition from 1959 to 1989 with no awareness of the intervening time. The discovery of Robert Chen eliminated any remaining possibility of isolated delusion or elaborate hoax. Two men found months apart on different coastlines, both matching crew records from a ship that sank 30 years earlier, both physically impossible, yet undeniably present. Their independent accounts aligned in every detail, from the sequence of events aboard the dying ship to the moment they entered life rafts, expecting immediate rescue. Maritime authorities convened special meetings to discuss the cases, but no official explanation emerged. Researchers suggested everything from collective amnesia to elaborate conspiracy, yet none could account for the physical evidence, fingerprints, period clothing, and authentic equipment that placed both men firmly in 1959, even as they sat in examination rooms in 1989. As authorities struggled to process the implications of two impossible survivors, reports from the recovery site of the SS Orang Medan's wreckage added another layer to the mystery. The research vessel Atlantis II positioned itself over the coordinates where the SS Orang Medan had rested for 30 years, its sonar equipment probing the darkness 3 miles below the surface. Dr. Marion Cross, a marine archaeologist with 20 years of experience studying deep-sea wrecks, had secured funding for the expedition after the discovery of the two survivors created renewed interest in the ship's final resting place. The mission's objectives were straightforward: document the wreck's condition, verify that it was indeed the Orang Medan, and if possible, gather information about the cargo that had caused the disaster. Cross and her team expected to find a vessel in advanced stages of deterioration, its metal corroded by decades of saltwater exposure, and its structure colonized by marine life in patterns typical of wrecks from the 1950s. The submersible Triton descended through layers of decreasing light on the morning of September 12th, carrying Cross and two technical specialists into the abyssal zone where sunlight never penetrates. Communication with the surface remained stable as the craft passed the 2-mile mark, its external lights cutting through water that pressed inward with crushing force. At approximately 15,000 feet, sonar detected the wreck's outline, and the Triton adjusted its approach to land on the seafloor several dozen yards from the main debris field. What appeared on the monitors as the light swept across the wreckage immediately struck Cross as wrong, in ways she struggled to articulate over the communication link to the Atlantis II. The ship's hull showed far less degradation than 3 decades of immersion should have produced. Sections of the superstructure remained remarkably intact, with paint still visible in places where marine growth should have obscured all surface details. Cross directed the submersible closer, examining areas where the metal should have been heavily corroded by the combination of saltwater, pressure, and time. Instead, some sections appeared almost pristine, as though the vessel had sunk recently rather than 30 years earlier. The contrast between heavily deteriorated areas and those showing minimal damage created a patchwork effect that violated every principle Cross understood about how wrecks aged in deep water. Moving along the hull toward the stern, the Triton's cameras captured details that deepened the mystery. The life raft davits, mechanisms used to deploy emergency rafts, showed signs of recent use despite the wreck's age. Ropes that should have been completely degraded by marine organisms, and time retained some structural integrity, hanging in positions that suggested they'd been disturbed within months rather than decades. One davit station appeared to be missing its life raft entirely, the securing mechanism open as though a raft had been released. But the degree of marine growth on the davit itself did not match the timeline such recent deployment would require. Cross documented these inconsistencies carefully, aware that her observations contradicted established understanding of deep-sea preservation. The door to the crew quarters stood partially open, a detail that troubled the team immediately. Doors on sunken vessels typically remained in whatever position they held at the moment of sinking, and the forces required to move a door at this depth were substantial. Cross manoeuvred the Triton closer, directing lights into the interior spaces visible through the opening. The amount of silt accumulation inside appeared less than expected, and certain surfaces showed areas inexplicably free of the sediment that should have settled uniformly over 3 decades. One cabin contained personal effects arranged on a shelf in ways that suggested recent habitation. A comb, a pocket watch, photographs in frames, objects that should have been displaced by the ship's violent sinking and subsequent settling on the seafloor. Temperature readings from the submersible's external sensors began fluctuating without apparent cause, showing variations of several degrees within minutes, despite the stable conditions normally found at such depths. The internal compass, designed to function reliably in any environment, started showing drift, its heading indicators shifting slightly, even though the Triton remained stationary relative to the wreck. Cross reported these anomalies to the surface team, checking and rechecking instruments to rule out equipment malfunction, but diagnostics showed all systems functioning within normal parameters. The disturbances appeared to originate from the wreck itself, as though some residual energy surrounded the vessel. The most significant finding came when cross-directed the Triton toward the cargo hold. The explosion and fire that had preceded the ship's sinking should have left this area heavily damaged, but sections of the hold remained structurally sound, with access hatches still sealed. Using the submersible's manipulator arms, Cross attempted to examine one of the hatches more closely, and the metal responded to touch with a faint vibration that registered on the craft's sensors. No natural process could account for vibration in a dead ship 3 miles underwater, yet the readings were unmistakable. Cross withdrew the manipulator arm and repositioned the Triton to capture video documentation of the phenomenon, and in reviewing the footage later, the team noticed something that had not been visible during the dive itself. For brief moments captured on camera, the wreck appeared different. The effect lasted only seconds and showed up in scattered frames rather than continuous video, but in those fragments, the ship looked newer, its lights visible in some portholes, shadows moving across the deck in ways that suggested activity aboard. The camera's timestamp remained consistent, ruling out playback errors or file corruption, and the images were clear enough to show impossible details. A figure standing near the rail, smoke rising from the stack, running lights illuminated despite no power source, having functioned for 30 years. Cross and her team reviewed the footage repeatedly, unable to explain how a camera recording physical reality could capture images that contradicted that reality so completely. Additional passes around the wreck revealed other anomalies. Certain sections showed marine growth patterns that matched expected 30-year colonization, while adjacent areas appeared nearly clean of biological accumulation. The variation defied explanation, as marine life does not colonize selectively without environmental factors that were not present at this uniform depth and location. Cross collected samples from both heavily colonized and relatively clean surfaces, noting that temperature readings continued to fluctuate near the areas showing less biological growth. The pattern suggested that something about those sections of the hull periodically discouraged marine organisms, but no known process could produce such effects on a derelict vessel. The dive lasted 6 hours, the maximum safe duration for the submersible systems at that depth, and Cross surfaced with more questions than answers. The team spent the following 2 days reviewing footage, analysing sensor data, and attempting to reconcile their observations with known principles of deep-sea archaeology. Chemical analysis of samples brought back from the wreck showed composition consistent with 1950s steel manufacturing, confirming the vessel's age, yet wear patterns on the metal suggested far less time underwater than the ship's history indicated. Dating techniques that measured marine organism accumulation produced inconsistent results, with some samples indicating 30 years of growth and others suggesting mere months. The strangest data came from spectral analysis of light captured in the video footage. In frames showing the wreck appearing newer or displaying impossible activity, the wavelengths of light did not match the submersible's external illumination. Instead, they corresponded to frequencies that would be produced by different light sources entirely, as though the camera had momentarily captured illumination from another time or place overlapping with the present. Cross consulted with optical physicists who could offer no mechanism by which a camera would record light that was not physically present, unless it was somehow detecting electromagnetic echoes of past events, a phenomenon with no basis in established science. Plans for a second dive to attempt entry into the cargo hold were abandoned after the submersible developed unexplained electrical issues during post-dive inspection. Systems that had functioned normally before the descent showed signs of exposure to intense electromagnetic fields, with circuit boards displaying damage patterns typically associated with electrical surges, despite all safety systems having remained operational throughout the dive. The Atlantis Descend's chief engineer recommended against further submersible operations near the wreck until the source of the interference could be identified and shielded against. But Cross knew that understanding the source would require the very investigation that had damaged their equipment. The research vessel returned to port with documentation of anomalies that challenged fundamental assumptions about how deep-sea wrecks behave. Cross's report, filed with maritime authorities and academic institutions, carefully documented the physical evidence without offering explanations, noting only that the wreck of the SS Orang Medan did not conform to expected patterns of deterioration and that unusual electromagnetic phenomena appeared to be associated with the site. The missing life raft, the preserved interiors, and the strange temporal fluctuations suggested that the wreck site itself might be caught in some form of ongoing disturbance, existing simultaneously in multiple states across time. Sample analyses were published in marine archaeology journals, accompanied by carefully worded discussions of the inconsistencies that left readers with more questions than conclusions. The Atlantis II returned to port with more questions than answers. The wreck of the SS Orang Medan rested where it had fallen in 1959, yet aspects of it defied 30 years of deep-sea deterioration. Dr. Cross's report, filed with maritime authorities and academic institutions, carefully documented the anomalies without offering explanations, noting only that the physical evidence did not align with expected decay patterns. The missing life raft, the preserved interiors, and the strange temporal fluctuations suggested that the wreck site itself might be caught in some form of temporal loop, accessing both its past and present simultaneously. For the research team, the descent had been more than a historical investigation. It had been an encounter with a place where time's normal progression seemed suspended. While scientists examined the impossible evidence from the deep, the two survivors continued to provide testimonies that deepened the mystery. In a secured conference room at the Maritime Research Facility in Boston, Thomas Kellerman and Robert Chen sat across from a panel of investigators, ready to recount the final hours aboard the SS Orang Medan in exhaustive detail. The two men had been given several weeks to stabilize psychologically and to begin processing the reality of their displacement, and authorities had determined that a comprehensive debriefing could no longer be delayed. Present in the room were representatives from the Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, Naval Intelligence, and several academic researchers specializing in maritime disasters. Dr. Harold Winters and Dr. Rachel Sorensen, the psychiatrists who had been working with Kellerman and Chen respectively, sat to one side to monitor the survivors' emotional states during what promised to be a difficult session. Commander Patricia Walsh opened the proceedings by explaining that the goal was not interrogation, but documentation, an attempt to preserve the most complete possible record of events that had occurred 30 years earlier, yet remained fresh in the survivors' memories. Both Kellerman and Chen had agreed to the session voluntarily, understanding that their testimonies represented potentially the only detailed account of what had happened aboard the Orang Medan in its final hours. Walsh emphasized that they could stop at any time if the process became too distressing, and she assured them that the session was being recorded both for accuracy and to prevent the need for repeated retellings of traumatic events. Kellerman began the account, describing the voyage's first 2 days as entirely routine. The weather had been favourable, the cargo secure, and the crew in good spirits as they made steady progress toward Manila. He had stood watch on the bridge during the evening of February 13th and noted nothing unusual in the ship's performance or the behaviour of other crew members. The sea had been calm, visibility good, and radio communications with coastal stations proceeding on schedule. When his watch ended at midnight, he had gone to his cabin expecting to sleep until his next duty shift, but he was awakened shortly after 2 a.m. by unusual sounds from the deck. Above, raised voices and the heavy footsteps of men moving with urgency rather than routine purpose. Chen took over the narrative at this point, describing how he had been on duty in the radio room when the first reports of illness began filtering up from below deck. A crew member from the engine room had come to the radio room personally rather than using the internal communication system, which Chen found strange until the man explained that several workers had collapsed and that Chief Engineer David Park was requesting medical assistance. Chen had immediately contacted the bridge to relay the information, and Captain van der Linde had gone below to assess the situation himself. Within 15 minutes, the captain returned with an expression that Chen described as beyond concern, approaching genuine fear, and ordered Chen to prepare a distress message while he investigated the cargo hold. The cargo, both men emphasized, had been the focus of suspicion from the moment crew members began falling ill. Kellerman explained that 3 days before departure, a last-minute addition to the manifest had been loaded under unusual circumstances. The crates had arrived at night, accompanied by military personnel, who supervised the loading personally, and who had spoken briefly with Captain van der Linde before departing without explanation. The crates themselves were unmarked except for symbols that Kellerman had not recognized, not standard shipping codes or markings from any language he knew. The captain had been told only that the cargo was classified, that it was bound for a military installation in the Philippines, and that under no circumstances were the crates to be opened during transport. Chen described the smell that had begun permeating the ship around the time crew members started collapsing. It was sweet and metallic simultaneously, a combination that reminded him of overheated electrical equipment mixed with something organic and cloying. The smell seemed to spread from the cargo hold upward through the ventilation system, growing stronger as more time passed. Crew members exposed to it began experiencing headaches and disorientation, some reporting that time seemed to be moving strangely, that clocks appeared wrong, and that the sun's position did not match their internal sense of how many hours had elapsed. Several men claimed to see things that were not there, shadows moving across bulkheads, figures standing in corridors that vanished when approached directly. The decision to open the cargo hold came after the captain found 3 crew members dead in the engine room with no apparent cause beyond exposure to the mysterious smell. Van der Linde, according to both survivors, had concluded that whatever was in those crates posed an immediate threat to everyone aboard, and that identifying the danger was worth violating the instructions he had been given. Kellerman had accompanied the captain and 2 other officers to the hold, while Chen remained at his radio post ready to send distress calls if the situation deteriorated further. What the boarding party found when they opened the first crate would be described by Kellerman with a precision that suggested the memory had been seared into his consciousness with extraordinary clarity. The crate's interior was lined with a material that looked like lead but seemed to shimmer slightly in the hold's artificial lighting. Nested within this lining were 3 smaller containers, each roughly the size of a shoebox, made of a dark metal that none of the men recognized. These containers were marked with the same strange symbols visible on the exterior of the crate, and they emitted a low humming sound that could be felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to pass through bone and tissue. The captain had reached to lift one of the containers for closer examination, and the moment his hand made contact with its surface, the container had cracked open along seams that had not been visible moments before. What emerged was described identically by both Kellerman and Chen, despite Chen not having been present in the hold. Kellerman had seen it directly, while Chen had heard the description from the captain over the internal communication system in the minutes before communications broke down entirely. A mist had poured from the opened container, pale and faintly luminescent, moving with purpose rather than dispersing naturally into the air. The mist had spread across the floor of the hold with unnatural speed, climbing the walls and reaching toward the men who stood frozen in shock at what they were witnessing. The smell intensified immediately, and Kellerman reported feeling a sudden disconnection from his body, as though he were observing himself from a distance, while his physical form continued to stand in the hold. The captain and the two officers with him had retreated from the hold, sealing the door behind them, but the mist had already begun seeping through ventilation ducts and gaps around the hatch. Within minutes, crew members throughout the ship were collapsing. Chen, isolated in the radio room on the upper deck, began sending the distress calls that would be recorded by coastal stations, describing the situation as best he could with information that made no sense even as he transmitted it. He reported watching his own hands move across the radio equipment while feeling as though time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to gauge how long each action took. The clock on the radio room wall showed one time, while his watch showed another, and both seemed to be running at incorrect speeds. Kellerman described returning to the deck to find crew members scattered in various states of collapse, some already dead with expressions of terror frozen on their faces, others still moving but showing no awareness of their surroundings. The captain had given the order to abandon ship, recognizing that whatever had been unleashed from the cargo could not be contained, and that their only chance of survival lay in getting away from the vessel entirely. Life rafts were deployed, though, in the confusion and with so many crew members incapacitated, only a few boats were successfully launched. Kellerman, Chen, and navigator David Park had entered one raft together, along with a fourth man whose name neither survivor could recall with certainty through the fog of trauma and terror. The moment of entering the life raft marked the point where both men's accounts took on a quality that investigators found most difficult to process. Kellerman and Chen both described a sensation of falling that had nothing to do with the physical act of descending from the ship into the raft. It was a fall through time itself, a vertigo that suggested the world had dropped away beneath them while they remained suspended in a moment that stretched to impossible duration. The Orang Medan, visible beside their raft, had appeared to flicker, showing multiple versions of itself simultaneously, burning and intact, sinking and floating, present and absent. The sky had seemed wrong, with stars visible despite it being early morning, and the sun appearing in positions that violated the time of day. Chen's description of this transitional moment included details about time distortion that were particularly specific. He remembered looking at his watch and seeing the hands move backward, then forward at accelerated speed, then stop entirely while he could still feel the mechanism vibrating against his wrist. The other men in the raft had spoken, but their voices reached his ears with significant delay, words arriving seconds after lips had finished forming them. The sensation had lasted both an instant and an eternity, a duration impossible to quantify, because the normal markers by which humans measure time had ceased functioning in any comprehensible way. Both survivors stated that their next clear memory after entering the raft was being rescued. Kellerman by Portuguese fishermen, Chen by jogger on a beach. Neither had any recollection of the intervening 30 years, no dreams or fragmented impressions, no sense of time passing beyond what should have been hours, or perhaps a day adrift. For them, February 14th, 1959, had been followed immediately by June and August of 1989, with 3 decades excised from their experience as cleanly as if those years had never existed. The impossibility of this claim was not lost on either man, and both acknowledged that they understood how their testimony sounded, but they maintained with absolute conviction that their subjective experience matched their account exactly. The panel questioned both survivors extensively about the fourth man who had been in the raft with them, and about David Park, whose fate remained unknown. Neither Kellerman nor Chen could explain why they had emerged in 1989 while their companions had not, or why they had been found separately rather than together in the same raft. Chen offered a tentative theory that perhaps the temporal displacement had affected each person differently, that some might still be trapped in the moment of transition, while others had passed through to emerge at different times or places. Kellerman suggested that the fourth man, whose identity remained frustratingly just beyond clear recall, might not have survived the transition at all, though he could not explain what might have killed someone in the process of moving through time. Polygraph examinations followed the debriefing, administered by specialists who had been briefed on the unprecedented nature of the case. Both Kellerman and Chen showed physiological responses consistent with truthful testimony, their stress markers aligning with genuine memory, recall rather than fabrication. While polygraph results were not considered definitive proof, they provided additional data suggesting that both men sincerely believed every element of their accounts. The examiners noted that certain questions about the temporal transition produced unusual readings, not indicative of deception, but rather of psychological confusion, as though the survivors were attempting to describe experiences for which human perception and memory were not adequately designed. The debriefing lasted 7 hours, with Kellerman and Chen recounting events that matched in every particular, despite having been separated for months after their rescue. The panel documented their testimonies in official reports that acknowledged the consistency of the accounts while offering no mechanism to explain how two men could experience an instant transition across 30 years. The nature of the cargo, the strange phenomena aboard ship, and the specific moment of temporal displacement remained subjects of speculation. What was documented beyond doubt was that both survivors believed, with absolute conviction, that they had stepped into a life raft in February 1959 and been pulled from the water in 1989 with no experience of the intervening decades. The cargo's contents, whatever they had been, remained at the bottom of the Atlantic, 3 miles down with the rest of the SS Orang Medan's secrets. The survivors' account of mysterious cargo prompted investigators to search historical records for any documentation of the ship's actual load. Archives in Singapore and military records offices across 3 continents yielded fragments of information about the SS Orang Medan's final cargo, each piece suggesting the ship had been carrying more than standard commercial freight. Dr. Margaret Doyle, an archivist specializing in Cold War-era shipping records, had been hired by maritime authorities to trace the documentary trail of what had been loaded aboard the vessel in February 1959. Her investigation began with the ship's official manifest, filed with Singapore port authorities prior to departure, which listed machinery parts, textiles, and general manufactured goods bound for Manila. The paperwork appeared routine and unremarkable, precisely the kind of cargo that would attract no special attention from customs officials or maritime regulators. Secondary documents told a different story. Doyle discovered a series of requisition forms buried in military archives, stamped with classification markings and dated to the week before the Orang Medan's final departure. These forms authorized the transfer of unspecified experimental materials from a naval research facility to transport via commercial vessel, with destination listed only as a military installation in the Western Pacific. The forms carried authorization signatures from officers whose names appeared in connection with various classified programs from the late 1950s, projects whose full details remained sealed decades later. No specific contents were described, only weight specifications hazard codes indicating special handling requirements, and notation that materials were to be loaded separately from commercial cargo and secured in a designated section of the hold. Cross-referencing these documents with port activity logs from Singapore revealed that the Urang Medan had received a late-night cargo delivery 3 days before its scheduled departure, unusual for a vessel that had already completed loading and been cleared for sailing. The delivery had been overseen by military personnel rather than civilian dock workers, and the relevant section of the port log showed an annotation indicating special security protocols had been observed. Doyle found mentions of sealed containers and restricted access to the loading area, with civilian crew members kept away from the cargo transfer process. The documentation suggested a deliberate effort to load classified materials aboard a commercial vessel in a manner that would avoid the scrutiny typically applied to military transport. Further investigation uncovered parallel programs from the same period. The late 1950s had seen extensive military research into a range of experimental technologies, from advanced propulsion systems to psychological warfare methods to attempts at manipulating fundamental forces of physics. Doyle identified at least 3 separate programs that had involved temporal research of various kinds, attempts to create radar systems that could detect objects before they arrived, experiments with time delay fuses that activated based on predicted rather than actual conditions, and theoretical work on using intense electromagnetic fields to affect the perceived flow of time within limited areas. These programs operated under different cover names and security classifications, but they shared common elements of attempting to gain tactical advantage through temporal manipulation. One program in particular drew Doyle's attention. Designated Project Kronos, in declassified summaries, it had operated from 1956 to 1959 under the auspices of a joint military-civilian research initiative. The project's stated goal, described in heavily redacted documents, involved developing technology to slow enemy response times through localized time distortion. The theoretical framework suggested that if time could be made to flow at different rates in different locations, forces within an accelerated time field would have effectively infinite time to act, while enemies in normal time remained frozen. The practical challenges were enormous, requiring exotic materials not available through conventional sources and energy generation far beyond what existing technology could provide. Records showed that several crew members of the Urang Medan had held military security clearances, unusual for a standard commercial vessel, but consistent with a ship tasked with transporting classified cargo. Captain van der Linde himself had commanded military transport missions during World War II and had worked on classified shipping runs in the years following the war. Thomas Kellerman's service record showed training in secure cargo handling, and David Park had connections to naval intelligence through previous postings. The crew composition suggested the Urang Medan had been selected specifically for its ability to transport sensitive materials with appropriate security awareness among key personnel. Doyle also discovered that the ship's intended route deviated from standard commercial shipping lanes, taking it through less trafficked waters despite the longer transit time this required. The deviation was minor enough not to raise immediate questions, but significant enough to keep the vessel away from areas where other ships might observe or offer assistance if problems arose. This routing, combined with the classified cargo and the specially cleared crew members, painted a picture of a mission that was commercial in appearance but military in nature, using a civilian vessel to transport experimental technology in a manner designed to avoid attention. The official inquiry into the Urang Medan's loss in 1959 had sealed certain sections of its investigation, a fact that Doyle discovered when attempting to access the complete case file. Documents that should have been routine, witness statements, technical assessments, conclusions about cause of loss, remained classified 30 years after the incident. Attempts to have these sections declassified were blocked by agencies citing ongoing security concerns, a justification that made little sense for a maritime disaster from decades earlier unless the cargo itself remained sensitive. The pattern of secrecy suggested that authorities in 1959 had known or suspected what the ship had been carrying and had deliberately obscured that information to prevent public knowledge of the experimental program. Connections to other incidents emerged as Doyle expanded her research. Several naval vessels from the same period had experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions or crew injuries during missions that records indicated involved similar classified cargo. One destroyer had reported temporal anomalies in its navigation systems after loading experimental equipment, with clocks running at incorrect speeds and chronometers showing impossible readings. Another vessel had suffered casualties among crew members exposed to materials described only as experimental power sources, with symptoms matching those reported aboard the Urang Medan. None of these incidents had resulted in total loss of the vessels involved, but the pattern suggested that whatever technology was being transported presented genuine hazards that were not fully understood by those handling it. Doyle's most significant finding came from a technical memo discovered in files related to Project Kronos. The memo, written by a scientist whose name had been redacted, described successful, small-scale creation of a localized temporal field using a device powered by what was termed exotic matter of unspecified origin. The field had produced measurable time dilation effects, with clocks inside the field running at different rates than those outside it. The memo noted that scaling up the technology presented challenges, particularly in containing the exotic matter and controlling the field's boundaries. The final paragraph, heavily redacted, mentioned plans for field testing under controlled conditions. With a date that placed the testing schedule in early 1959, the circumstantial case assembled by Doyle suggested that the Urang Medan had been carrying a prototype temporal field generator, along with the exotic matter required to power it, that the device had activated prematurely during transport, and that the resulting temporal distortion had killed the crew while creating an ongoing anomaly that persisted at the wreck site. The theory explained the survivors' experience of instantaneous transition across 30 years, the phantom ship sightings as temporal echoes bleeding through to the present, and the strange properties documented during the submersible expedition. Military officials declined to comment when presented with Doyle's findings, offering only standard responses about not discussing classified programs regardless of their age. By late November, Doyle had assembled a circumstantial case that the SS Urang Medan had been carrying experimental materials whose nature remained classified 3 decades later. Military officials declined to comment, citing national security concerns even for events from 1959. Whatever had been aboard the ship, it had been important enough to warrant secrecy then, and continued classification in 1989. Whether those materials had caused the crew's death and the subsequent temporal anomalies remained a matter of speculation, but the pattern was clear. The ship's final voyage had been anything but routine. The cargo that went down with the Urang Medan might hold the answer to how 2 men could leap across 30 years in an instant, but that answer rested in a cargo hold 3 miles beneath the Atlantic, in darkness and pressure that made retrieval impossible. As the cargo investigation reached its limits, another impossible radio transmission was received. Winter storms battered the Atlantic coast when radio operators at the same Halifax station where Samuel Brennan had received the first transmission heard the crackling static of another incoming signal at 2:13 a.m. on December 19, 1989. Brennan was not on duty that night, but the operator, who was Michael Torres, had been briefed on the March incident and recognized immediately that the frequency and signal characteristics matched those earlier impossible transmissions. Torres activated the recording equipment and alerted his supervisor before the voice fully emerged from the interference, ensuring that whatever followed would be captured and verified from the start. The transmission began with standard maritime distress protocols, a caller identifying his vessel and requesting assistance, but the ship's name stopped Torres mid-motion as he reached for the response microphone. The voice identified itself as belonging to James Martinez, assistant engineer aboard the SS Urang Medan, and provided coordinates placing the caller approximately 80 miles from where the March transmission had originated. Martinez's voice carried the stress of someone in genuine distress, higher pitched than the earlier caller, and with an accent that suggested Spanish as a first language. He reported that his ship had sunk, and that he had been adrift in a life raft for what he described as several days, though his sense of time had become unreliable. The phrasing and terminology matched the era of the ship's 1959 loss, with references to equipment and procedures that had been standard in that period but had since been superseded by modern maritime practices. What made this transmission remarkable compared to the March event was its duration and the level of detail Martinez provided. The earlier call had lasted 40 minutes and consisted primarily of distress messages and ship status reports. This transmission continued for 47 minutes, during which Martinez engaged in what seemed like genuine communication, despite being unable to hear any responses from the operators attempting to reach him. He described his situation as though speaking to rescuers who were acknowledging his words, pausing at intervals as if listening for replies, then continuing with growing confusion when no answers came. The one-sided conversation created an eerie sense of communication across a barrier that allowed sound to pass in only one direction. Martinez reported seeing other life rafts in the distance when he had first abandoned ship, specifically mentioning rafts containing Thomas Kellerman and Robert Chen, along with other crew members he named. His description of who had been in which raft corroborated the testimonies Kellerman and Chen had given months earlier, providing independent verification of details that had not been made public. He described the chaos of abandoning the vessel, the strange smell that had filled the ship before the evacuation, and the captain's final orders to get away from the Urang Medan as quickly as possible. Each element aligned with the accounts provided by the two survivors, adding credibility to testimonies that some had questioned despite the physical evidence supporting them. As the transmission progressed, Martinez's descriptions took on qualities that suggested he was experiencing the same temporal displacement that had affected Kellerman and Chen. He reported that the sun's position seemed wrong for the time his watch indicated, that stars were visible in the sky despite it being early morning, and that passing ships were ignoring his distress flares despite being close enough to see them clearly. His frustration mounted as he described waving frantically at vessels that passed within visual range without acknowledging his presence, as though he existed in a space adjacent to, but not quite part of the world around him. The sense of being simultaneously present and invisible, of existing in a reality slightly offset from normal space, came through in his increasingly agitated descriptions. Torres and other operators at multiple stations attempted repeatedly to respond to Martinez's transmissions, broadcasting on the same frequency with high-power equipment that should have reached any receiver within hundreds of miles. Their responses went unacknowledged, with Martinez continuing his monologue as though broadcasting into a void. Technical analysis later confirmed that the stations were transmitting properly and that any functioning radio within the reported coordinates should have received the signals clearly. The one-way nature of the communication suggested that Martinez existed in a temporal or spatial position where he could project outward but could not receive incoming transmissions, as though speaking from behind a one-way mirror that allowed his voice through but blocked all attempts to reach him. The most chilling portion of the transmission came in its final minutes, when Martinez described seeing lights in the water around his raft. He characterized them as unlike anything in his experience, not the running lights of ships or the bioluminescence sometimes visible in tropical waters, but patterns of illumination that seemed to move with purpose beneath the surface. His voice took on a tone of wonder, mixed with growing unease as he attempted to describe what he was witnessing. Struggling to find words for phenomenon his vocabulary could not encompass. Time itself felt wrong, he reported, as though moments were stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to judge duration or sequence. Martinez's voice began to distort in the transmission's final 30 seconds, the pitch dropping and the speed slowing as though the recording itself were being played at incorrect speed, though technical analysis confirmed the recording equipment had functioned normally throughout. Words became elongated, syllables separating and losing coherence, until the transmission ended, not with a clean break, but with a gradual dissolution into static. The effect suggested not that Martinez had stopped speaking, but that whatever had allowed his voice to reach across time was collapsing, pulling him back into whatever temporal space he occupied, while severing his connection to 1989. Coast Guard vessels were dispatched immediately to the coordinates Martinez had provided, though operators held little hope of finding him given the pattern established by previous incidents. The search covered an extensive area over the following 24 hours, but as expected, no life raft was located, no debris field indicated recent presence, and radar showed no contacts that might correspond to a survivor. The ocean at those coordinates appeared entirely normal, with water temperature, current patterns, and weather conditions all within expected ranges for mid-December in that region. Whatever had allowed Martinez to transmit across 30 years had left no physical trace that modern equipment could detect. James Martinez's name was verified through crew records, confirming him as having been aboard the Urang Medan in 1959. He had been 23 years old at the time of the ship's loss, born in Caracas in 1936, and had worked as assistant engineer on several vessels before joining the Urang Medan's crew 6 months prior to its final voyage. His service record showed him to be competent and reliable, with no history of mental instability or tendency toward fabrication. The man whose voice had been recorded crying out for rescue across 3 decades had been real, his distress genuine, and his death in 1959 now documented not just through archived reports, but through his own words transmitted impossibly to an era he would never reach. Kellerman and Chen, when informed of the transmission and allowed to listen to portions of it, both confirmed that the voice was Martinez's and that his description of events matched their memories. Both men became emotional, hearing their colleague calling for help decades after his death, and both expressed guilt that they had survived while Martinez had not. The knowledge that he had been alive in some sense during the months between their own rescues, calling out from a temporal position that prevented him from ever being found, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. The December transmission was archived alongside the March recording, providing investigators with 90 minutes of impossible communication from a man who had died 3 decades earlier. Martinez's account of being adrift for days matched what survivors Kellerman and Chen had described. The sensation of entering a life raft and then immediately being rescued, though for Martinez, that rescue never came. His voice, preserved on magnetic tape, called out across a gap of 30 years to operators who could hear but not respond, creating a one-way bridge between 1959 and 1989. The coordinates he transmitted were searched thoroughly, but like everything else connected to the SS Urang Medan, they yielded only empty ocean and unanswered questions. The pattern of transmissions and survivor discoveries continued into the new decade. Exactly 31 years after the SS Urang Medan sank on February 14, 1990, a Coast Guard patrol investigating the coordinates from the December radio transmission discovered a life raft floating in calm seas. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, commanding the cutter Steadfast on routine patrol, had been briefed on the Urang Medan case and had specifically requested assignment to waters where the phenomena had been occurring. The discovery of the raft vindicated his decision to take the assignment seriously rather than dismissing it as pursuit of maritime legend. His crew approached the small orange vessel with a mixture of anticipation and unease, uncertain whether they would find it empty or occupied, and if occupied, what condition any survivor might be in after the pattern established by previous discoveries. The raft contained a single occupant, a man lying unconscious but breathing, his physical appearance matching the age discrepancy that had characterized the previous survivors. He wore a merchant marine uniform from the 1950s, salt-stained and damaged by exposure, but recognizably authentic to that period. His face showed the weathering of someone who had spent considerable time at sea, and his hands bore the calluses of manual labor with ropes and machinery. Unlike Kellerman and Chen, who had been found after apparent days or weeks adrift, this man's condition suggested more recent exposure, as though he had entered the raft within the past 24 hours, rather than having spent extended time floating without rescue. The Coast Guard crew transferred the survivor to their vessel and began immediate medical treatment, establishing IV fluids and monitoring vital signs as they radioed ahead to arrange hospital reception. The man remained unconscious during the 90-minute transit to port, his condition stable but showing no signs of imminent awakening. His pockets yielded identification documents that immediately connected him to the Orang Medan mystery. A waterlogged wallet containing a crew card issued in 1958 bearing the name David Park and listing his position as navigator aboard the SS Orang Medan. The date's significance was not lost on anyone involved in the rescue. Finding a third survivor on the exact anniversary of the ship's sinking suggested pattern rather than coincidence, as though whatever force had displaced these men through time operated according to rules that included temporal resonance with the original event. David Park regained consciousness on the morning of February 15th at a hospital in Boston, having been transported directly to the facility where Kellerman and Chen remained under observation. His awakening followed the now familiar pattern of confusion about date and location, though Park's disorientation seemed less severe than that experienced by the earlier survivors. He asked immediately what year it was, as though already suspecting that something had gone wrong with time itself, and his reaction to being told it was 1990 suggested he had been partially prepared for displacement, even if the scale of it shocked him. His first coherent question, after processing the date, was whether Thomas Kellerman and Robert Chen had been found, indicating that his last clear memories included entering the life raft with them. Medical examination revealed the same biological impossibility that had characterized the previous cases. Park appeared physically to be in his late 30s, with cellular markers and tissue analysis confirming this assessment, yet records showed he had been born in 1918, which would make him 72 years old if he had survived normally from 1959 to 1990. Fingerprint analysis matched service records from the 1940s, and dental examination showed work consistent with 1950s dentistry with no subsequent care from the intervening decades. Every physical test confirmed that David Park was simultaneously a man in his late 30s and a man who should be in his 70s, existing in a state that violated fundamental biological principles while remaining undeniably real and present. Park's account of the ship's final hours aligned with the testimonies provided by Kellerman and Chen, adding details about navigation and the ship's course that only someone in his position would have known. He described plotting the vessel's position just before crew members began falling ill, and noting that the ship's chronometer had been showing time that did not match his calculations based on celestial observation. The discrepancy had troubled him enough that he had mentioned it to the captain, but in the crisis that followed, the anomaly had been forgotten amid more immediate concerns about dying crew members and the decision to abandon ship. Park's technical knowledge allowed him to provide specifics about the ship's exact position and heading that matched archived data from the original incident, lending additional credibility to an account that physical evidence already supported. What made Park's testimony particularly valuable was his description of what had occurred after entering the life raft, a period that Kellerman and Chen remembered only as confused sensation and disorientation. Park described the experience with greater clarity, perhaps because his position as navigator had trained him to observe and document even under extreme stress. He reported that immediately after the raft was launched, the world around them had seemed to fracture, showing multiple versions of the same moment simultaneously. The Orang Medan had been visible in several states at once, burning, intact, sinking, floating, as though past, present, and future versions of the ship existed simultaneously in the same space. The other men in the raft had reacted with panic and confusion, but Park had attempted to maintain observation, recognizing even then that they were experiencing something unprecedented. Time within the raft had behaved in ways Park described as non-linear. He remembered seeing James Martinez, the assistant engineer who had transmitted the December distress call, simply cease to exist between one moment and the next, not falling overboard or dying, but vanishing as completely as though he had been edited out of reality. The remaining three men, Park, Kellerman, and Chen, had watched in horror as their companion disappeared, and Park specifically remembered thinking that they might all vanish in the same way, deleted from time, as whatever force was displacing them operated according to rules they could not comprehend. The sensation of being in the raft had been simultaneously instantaneous and eternal, a duration that Park could not quantify because the markers by which humans measure time had ceased to function in any meaningful way. Park's description of temporal displacement included a detail that neither previous survivor had been able to articulate clearly. He reported experiencing what he called phases, distinct moments within the overall transition where the raft seemed to stabilize briefly before shifting again. During these stable phases, he could see the normal world around him, ocean, sky, passing ships, but could not interact with it, as though separated by an invisible barrier. He had seen rescue vessels pass close enough to touch, had watched commercial ships cross within visual range, and had observed changes in weather and light that suggested time was passing in the world beyond the raft, even though no time seemed to pass for those within it. The experience suggested not a single, instantaneous jump from 1959 to 1990, but rather a series of moments where the raft touched briefly on different points in time before finally stabilizing in February 1990. The reunion between Park and his fellow survivors provided emotional validation of accounts that some had continued to question, despite accumulating evidence. The three men recognized one another immediately, embracing with the intensity of people who had shared traumatic experience and believed themselves alone in that experience until this moment. Their conversations, observed and recorded by medical staff, showed the natural flow of colleagues continuing discussions from what for them had been days earlier, but which from an external perspective had occurred months apart. They referenced shared moments aboard the Orang Medan with the familiarity of recent memory, asked after other crew members by name, and discussed their displacement with a mixture of horror and grim solidarity that came from having experienced the impossible together. Investigators questioned Park extensively about the fourth man who had been in the raft, the crew member whose identity neither Kellerman nor Chen had been able to recall clearly. Park confirmed that there had been a fourth occupant, a young deckhand named William Strauss, who had been in his early 20s when the ship went down. Park's description of Strauss matched crew records, and his account of the man's panic during the temporal displacement provided context for why the other survivors had fragmented memories of him. According to Park, Strauss had been nearly incoherent with fear during the transition, and his behaviour had become increasingly erratic until the moment he too had simply vanished from the raft in the same manner as Martinez. Park believed that whatever force was selecting, who would be displaced, and who would remain trapped in the transition, had operated according to criteria none of them could understand, but that Strauss and Martinez had somehow failed to complete the journey, that Park, Kellerman, and Chen had survived. Psychological evaluation revealed that Park had processed the trauma of displacement with slightly greater stability than the earlier survivors, perhaps because his training in navigation had given him frameworks for thinking about position and movement through space, that he could adapt, however imperfectly, to movement through time. Dr. Harold Winters, who conducted the assessment, noted that Park showed the same fundamental disconnect from the present that characterized Kellerman and Chen, but that he had developed rudimentary coping mechanisms more quickly. Park described feeling like an observer in 1990 rather than a participant, watching a world that felt like elaborate historical recreation rather than lived reality. The psychological impact was no less severe than what the other survivors experienced, but Park's ability to articulate it provided researchers with better understanding of how displacement affected human consciousness. All 3 survivors underwent additional medical testing as a group, with researchers looking for shared characteristics that might explain why these particular men had survived temporal displacement when others had not. The tests revealed unusual synchronization in certain biological rhythms, heartbeat patterns, brainwave activity, and cellular regeneration rates showed coordination across all 3 men that exceeded what would be expected from random chance. The synchronization suggested that the displacement had created some form of connection between them at a biological level, linking them through shared experience of temporal transition in ways that persisted even after they had returned to normal space-time. Whether this connection was consequence or cause of their survival remained unclear, but its existence provided the first measurable biological marker of temporal displacement beyond the age discrepancy itself. With David Park's recovery, authorities had 3 men who physically could not exist in 1990, yet undeniably did. The pattern was complete. 2 survivors found through chance rescue, 1 discovered at precise coordinates and date. Each man corroborated the other's accounts, while adding unique details about the temporal distortion they had experienced. 37 crew members had abandoned the SS Orang Medan in 1959. 3 had arrived in the late 1980s and early 1990s with no memory of the passage of time. The fate of the other 34 remained unknown, suspended somewhere between the moment they entered life rafts and a present they would never reach. The 3 survivors represented not just impossible rescues, but evidence that time itself had fractured around the sinking ship, creating pockets where the normal flow of years could be crossed in an instant. As the 3 survivors worked with psychiatrists to process their displacement, other strange events continued around the original sinking coordinates. Throughout 1990 and into 1991, maritime traffic through the North Atlantic sector, where the SS Orang Medan had sunk, reported an increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena. Commercial vessels following standard shipping routes began encountering compass malfunctions when passing within 50 miles of the wreck's coordinates, with magnetic needles spinning or pointing in directions that contradicted satellite navigation systems. Electronic equipment aboard ships showed temporary failures that resolved once vessels moved beyond the affected area, suggesting a localized field of interference centered on the location where the Orang Medan rested 3 miles below. Captains who had sailed these waters for decades without incident found themselves filing unusual occurrence reports with maritime authorities documenting events that fell outside the normal range of technical problems or weather-related difficulties. The electromagnetic disturbances manifested in patterns that defied conventional explanation. Ships' clocks would run fast or slow while within the zone, gaining or losing minutes over the course of hours before returning to correct time once clear of the area. GPS systems displayed positions that did not match visual landmarks or depth sounder readings, sometimes showing vessels as being miles from their actual locations. Radio communications became unreliable, with transmissions cutting in and out or carrying strange background interference that sounded almost like voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Crew members reported feeling disoriented when passing through certain sections of the affected waters, experiencing brief moments of temporal confusion where they could not clearly remember the preceding minutes or where time seemed to compress and expand in ways that left them unsettled and uncertain. Multiple ships logged brief radiostatic bursts on the frequency that had been used by the SS Orang Medan, transmissions that lasted only seconds but that occurred with enough regularity to establish pattern. The bursts came without identifiable source, appearing on equipment monitoring the maritime distress channels as brief spikes of activity that contained no discernible message. Analysis of recorded samples showed that the static carried embedded patterns suggesting human speech heavily distorted by interference, but attempts to filter and enhance the recordings produced only fragments, individual words or partial phrases in accents consistent with multilingual crew members from the 1950s, never enough to constitute complete communication, but sufficient to suggest that something or someone was attempting to transmit. Several commercial vessels reported experiencing missing time while transiting the area, arriving at their destinations minutes or hours later than their speed and course should have produced despite maintaining steady progress throughout the voyage. Captains double-checked their calculations and reviewed navigation logs, finding no period of reduced speed or course deviation that could account for the delays. Yet arrival timestamps documented at port facilities confirmed that more time had elapsed than the ship's internal records showed. The discrepancies were small, never more than a few hours, but their consistency across multiple vessels suggested genuine temporal anomaly rather than simple navigation error or equipment malfunction. Research teams attempting to study the phenomena deployed remote sensing equipment in the affected zone, anchoring autonomous buoys equipped with instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, water temperature, pressure variations, and other physical parameters. The data collected revealed unusual readings that correlated with reports from passing ships. Electromagnetic field strength fluctuated wildly, sometimes showing spikes hundreds of times stronger than Earth's normal magnetic field, occurring in pulses that followed no predictable pattern. Water temperature showed localized variations of several degrees within small areas, creating thermal boundaries that should not exist in the relatively uniform conditions of deep ocean waters. Most strangely, some sensors recorded what appeared to be temporal displacement in their own internal clocks, showing timestamps that did not match satellite time synchronization, despite the systems being designed to prevent exactly such drift. Acoustic monitoring detected unusual sounds emanating from the depths near the wreck site. The sounds did not match any known biological source or mechanical noise from ships or submarines, instead consisting of low-frequency tones that rose and fell in patterns that some researchers described as almost musical. Spectral analysis revealed that these sounds carried frequencies that should not propagate efficiently through water at those depths, suggesting either an unknown acoustic phenomenon or sounds originating from a source not bound by normal physical principles. Some recordings captured what seemed to be machinery noise, engines, ventilation systems, metal under stress, despite no active vessels being present in the area and the Orang Medan itself having been dead and dark for over 3 decades. One research vessel, the Atlantic Observer, reported recording full-spectrum audio that appeared to contain human voices during a monitoring run in August 1990. The recording, lasting approximately 3 minutes, captured what sounded like multiple people speaking, their words overlapping and distorted but occasionally resolving into recognizable phrases. Analysis identified fragments in at least 3 different languages, English, Dutch, and what linguists suggested was Indonesian or a related dialect, matching the multilingual composition of the Aurang Medan's crew. One phrase emerged clearly enough for transcription. "Help us!" The words were repeated several times across the recording, delivered in tones that suggested desperation and fear, though whether the recording represented actual voices or some form of acoustic artifact remained disputed among researchers. The frequency and intensity of phenomena showed clear correlation with the calendar, intensifying as each February 14th approached. Ships passing through the area in early February reported more severe compass deviations, longer periods of radio interference, and stronger sensations of disorientation among crew members. The pattern suggested that whatever force was generating the disturbances operated on an annual cycle, reaching peak activity on the anniversary of the original sinking before declining gradually over the following months. This cyclical nature allowed maritime authorities to issue informal advisories recommending that commercial traffic avoid the zone during the first 2 weeks of February, when possible, though the advisories were worded carefully to avoid explicitly acknowledging paranormal activity. Coast Guard vessels monitoring the area during the February 1991 anniversary period documented the most intense manifestation since the survivors' discoveries. Multiple ships reported seeing lights beneath the water's surface, described as pale blue and moving in organized patterns rather than drifting naturally with currents. The lights appeared at depths that should have been beyond the reach of sunlight, and their movements suggested purpose or intelligence, forming geometric shapes and following paths that repeated with precision. Attempts to investigate with sonar produced inconsistent results, sometimes showing large contacts at the reported depths, other times showing nothing, despite visual confirmation of the light's presence. One Coast Guard crew reported that their sonar briefly detected what appeared to be a large vessel-sized object rising from the depths before the contact dissolved and disappeared from instruments, even as the lights remained visible. The 3 survivors, Kellerman, Chen and Park, experienced severe symptoms during each February anniversary period, reporting headaches, disorientation, and the sensation of being pulled toward the ocean. Medical monitoring during these episodes showed unusual patterns in their brain activity, with neural firing becoming synchronized across all 3 men, despite their being in separate rooms. Their heart rates aligned to beat in unison for periods lasting several minutes, a coordination that had no medical explanation and that ceased completely once the anniversary dates passed. During the most intense episodes, all 3 reported experiencing vivid sensory impressions of being aboard the Aurang Medan again, hearing voices of dead crew members and smelling the strange odour that had preceded the disaster. These experiences felt completely real while they lasted, creating temporary confusion about which timeline the survivors actually occupied. Insurance companies began noting unusual clusters of claims from vessels transiting the affected area, with incidents ranging from equipment failures to crew injuries that occurred without clear cause. While individual claims appeared routine, the aggregate pattern showed statistical anomaly that actuaries could not attribute to normal maritime hazards. Some shipping companies quietly adjusted routes to avoid the zone entirely, citing vague operational concerns rather than explicitly acknowledging the reported phenomena. Others maintained standard routing, but issued internal advisories to crews about heightened vigilance when passing through certain coordinates, using carefully neutral language that avoided terms like anomaly or disturbance, while making clear that the area required special attention. Academic papers began appearing in journals dedicated to anomalous phenomena, documenting the Aurang Medan zone as a persistent area of temporal and electromagnetic disturbance. Researchers from various disciplines, oceanography, physics, psychology, maritime history, contributed studies examining different aspects of the phenomena. consensus emerged that something genuinely unusual was occurring in the waters where the ship had gone down, though explanations ranged from unknown oceanographic processes to residual effects from classified military technology to suggestions of spacetime distortion caused by the experimental cargo. No single theory commanded majority acceptance, but the volume of documentation made dismissing the entire body of evidence increasingly difficult for skeptical observers. Skeptics attributed the reports to psychological suggestion and normal maritime incidents misinterpreted through the lens of an existing legend. They pointed to the power of expectation in shaping perception, arguing that crews who had heard about the Urang Medan mystery would be primed to interpret ordinary equipment malfunctions as paranormal events. This explanation struggled to account for the consistent patterns in instrument readings, the correlation with anniversary dates, and the biological synchronization observed in the survivors, but it satisfied those who found temporal anomalies too far outside accepted physical principles to accept regardless of evidence. By late 1991, the stretch of North Atlantic where the SS Urang Medan rested had developed a reputation among maritime professionals as a place where the ordinary rules seemed suspended. While scientific measurements documented genuine anomalies, no unified theory emerged to explain why this particular location produced such consistent disturbances. The 3 survivors, monitored in their facility, reported experiencing temporal disorientation on February 14th each year, headaches, disorientation, and the sensation of being pulled back toward 1959. For those who worked the Atlantic shipping lanes, the Urang Medan zone became a place to avoid when possible and traverse quickly when necessary, a patch of ocean where time itself seemed wounded, bleeding moments from past into present in ways that instruments could detect but not explain. The accumulated evidence prompted an international conference to address the phenomenon. The conference room at MIT's Oceanic Studies Center, filled with researchers, naval officials, and temporal physics theorists, on March 8, 1992, convened to address what had become known simply as the Urang Medan problem. Dr. Helena Voss, a theoretical physicist who had spent 2 decades studying closed time-like curves and their implications for causality, had organized the gathering after concluding that the accumulated evidence warranted serious interdisciplinary attention. Attendees represented 12 countries and disciplines ranging from marine archaeology to quantum mechanics, unified by the shared acknowledgement that something genuinely anomalous had occurred and continued to occur in connection with the sunken vessel. The 3 survivors sat in the front row, present to provide testimony, but also to serve as living proof that whatever theories were discussed had to account for human beings who existed in defiance of normal temporal progression. Presentations began with documentation of the established facts, the 1959 sinking, the radio transmissions received in 1989, the discovery of 3 survivors whose physical ages did not match their chronological ages, the wreck anomalies, and the ongoing disturbances in the affected zone. Dr. Marion Cross presented findings from the submersible expedition, showing footage of the wreck in states of preservation that violated expected deterioration patterns, and video frames capturing impossible images of activity aboard a ship that had been dead for decades. Radio specialists analysed the recorded transmissions, demonstrating that the voices were genuine human speech transmitted via radio waves, not recordings or atmospheric echoes, yet originating from a source that should not have existed in 1989. Medical testimony came. The team of physicians who had examined and continued to monitor the survivors. Dr. Margaret Chen presented cellular analysis showing that Kellerman, Park and Chen possessed biological markers placing their births in the early 20th century, while their tissue aging indicated bodies in their late 30s. The contradiction existed at every level of biological organization, from genetic markers to cellular structures, to organ system development. Fingerprint evidence confirmed their identities as men who had served aboard the Urang Medan, while every biological indicator confirmed they had aged only to their late 30s before some process had frozen or displaced them through time. The medical evidence alone was sufficient to demonstrate that conventional understanding of human biology was incomplete, as these men existed in states that textbooks declared impossible. Theoretical frameworks were presented by physicists attempting to explain how temporal displacement might occur. Dr. Voss outlined the concept of closed time-like curves, solutions to Einstein's field equations that theoretically allow paths through spacetime that loop back on themselves. If such curves could be generated artificially, she argued, they might create zones where time flowed at different rates, or where objects could move between different temporal positions. The energy requirements for generating such curves were astronomical by conventional standards, but if the classified cargo had included exotic matter with negative mass-energy properties, the requirements might have been achievable on a localized scale. Her presentation included mathematical models showing how a temporal field generator could create a bubble of distorted spacetime that would appear to outside observers as instantaneous displacement, while those within the bubble experienced continuous time. An alternative theory came from Dr. James Rourke, a quantum physicist who specialized in entanglement and superposition. He proposed that the experimental device had created quantum entanglement between the ship in 1959 and future time periods, allowing states from different temporal positions to overlap and interact. In this framework, the survivors had not traveled through time in a conventional sense, but rather existed in superposition across multiple temporal states, collapsing into the present only when observed by rescue crews. The phantom ship sightings would represent moments when the quantum superposition became partially observable, showing echoes of the vessel's state from various points in its history. While the theory was elegant, Rourke acknowledged it required extending quantum mechanical principles to macroscopic objects in ways that had no experimental precedent. Military representatives present at the conference declined to discuss the cargo's specific composition, citing classification restrictions that remained in effect despite the passage of decades. This refusal frustrated researchers who understood that knowing the device's design and the properties of the exotic matter powering it would be essential to developing accurate theoretical models. What the military officials would acknowledge was that late 1950s research had included attempts to manipulate localized spacetime properties for strategic advantage, that at least one prototype device had been constructed, and that this device had been aboard the SS Urang Medan during its final voyage. They confirmed that the device had activated prematurely due to unknown causes, and that all subsequent research in that direction had been terminated following the disaster. Beyond these admissions, they offered nothing, leaving researchers to work from incomplete information. The conference reached consensus on several points, despite ongoing theoretical disagreements. All attendees agreed that the phenomena associated with the SS Urang Medan were real and not attributable to psychological factors, equipment malfunction, or natural causes. The survivors' physical impossibility was accepted as documented fact rather than disputed claim. The ongoing disturbances in the affected zone were acknowledged as genuine anomalies requiring explanation beyond conventional maritime or meteorological processes. Where consensus broke down was in mechanism, how the temporal displacement had occurred, whether it could be reversed, and what the implications were for fundamental physics. Ethical questions emerged during discussions about the survivors' legal and social status. If the three men were genuinely from 1959, existing in bodies that had aged only to their late 30s, were they chronologically 70-plus years old, or biologically in their 30s? The question had implications for everything from social security benefits to marriage status to medical care decisions. Some argued that biological age should take precedence, treating the survivors as younger men whose life expectancy and needs matched their physical state. Others contended that chronological age was the only defensible standard, regardless of the temporal anomaly that had preserved their bodies. The debate remained unresolved, with different jurisdictions reaching different conclusions about how to handle unprecedented cases where legal frameworks assumed age markers that could not be contradicted by biological evidence. Discussion of the other 34 crew members who had not emerged from temporal displacement raised troubling possibilities. Were they dead, trapped in the transition process, or existing in some state that had not yet intersected with present time? Park's testimony about crew members vanishing from the life raft suggested that the displacement process was not uniform, that some individuals had been eliminated from the transition while others completed it successfully. Whether those who vanished had died or remained suspended in temporal limbo was unknowable without understanding the mechanism by which the displacement occurred. The question haunted survivors who carried guilt about having reached the present while their colleagues had not. The conference adjourned after 3 days with comprehensive documentation, but no unified theory explaining the Urang Medan phenomena. Dr. Voss's final report acknowledged that existing physics offered possible frameworks for understanding temporal displacement, but lacked the experimental verification or specific technical details needed to confirm any particular explanation. The survivors remained living proof that temporal anomalies could affect human beings. Their impossibility documented beyond doubt, yet their existence resistant to complete theoretical explanation. For those who had gathered to address the mystery, the conference represented acknowledgement of a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions while remaining firmly anchored in documented evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The SS Urang Medan had created a wound in time that science could observe and measure, but not yet heal or fully comprehend.